Orson Pike didn't even look up from his ledger when he said it. "You have until sundown." That was all. No apology, no hesitation. Just 5 words delivered like he was reading a grocery list. While Elowen Rusk stood in the middle of that frozen council room, 30 years old, freshly widowed, her mother sitting just outside the door wrapped in a wool blanket that was starting to fray at the edges. The temperature outside was 35 degrees below zero, and the most powerful man in Coldwater Crossing had just told her to leave. Not tomorrow. Not after the storm passed. Sundown. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you've called home, if you've ever watched someone decide your life wasn't worth protecting, then you already know exactly how Elowen felt standing in that room. And if you haven't, ask yourself this: what would you have done? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories about ordinary people pushed to the edge of everything, and what happened when they refused to break. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, and if it moves you, and I think it will, hit that like button. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to that council room, because what happened next is something Coldwater Crossing never forgot. The council room smelled like pipe smoke and wet boots, and the fire in the corner hadn't been properly fed since morning. 14 men sat around a long pine table, and not one of them was looking at Elowen Rusk directly. That was the thing she noticed first. They'd called this meeting about her future, about her home, about whether she had any right to remain in the only settlement she'd ever known, and not a single one of them could hold her gaze for more than 2 seconds, except Orson Pike. I was looking at her. He'd been looking at her since she walked in, and the expression on his face wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something worse. It was assessment. The way a man looks at livestock he's deciding whether to sell or put down. Calculating, cold, completely certain of the outcome before the conversation had even begun. Elowen had known Orson Pike her entire life. He'd been council chairman since she was 11 years old, since before she understood what a council chairman was, or why it mattered. He'd presided over her father's funeral. He'd signed the papers when she and Thomas married. He'd shaken Thomas's hand at that wedding with genuine warmth, because Thomas Rusk had been exactly the kind of man Orson Pike respected. Lean, capable-looking, the son of a man who'd helped build this settlement from nothing. And then Thomas died. Fever, in September. Quick and terrible and without warning. And now it was December, and Elowen was standing in this smoky room, and the 14 men of Coldwater Crossing were about to decide what happened to her life. The property, Pike said, finally looking back down at his ledger, belonged to the Rusk family through Thomas's lineage. With no male here and no surviving adult male relative to claim stewardship, I'm his wife. Elowen's voice came out steadier than she expected. I lived in that cabin for 6 years. You lived there as Thomas's wife, yes. Pike's tone was patient in the way that powerful men's tones get patient, not because they're actually listening, but because they've already decided, and they're just waiting for the other person to tire themselves out. The settlement charter is clear on the matter of property succession. I didn't write the charter, Mrs. Rusk. I'm simply upholding it. The charter was written 30 years ago. And it still stands. The man to Pike's left, Harlan Voss, who ran the feed store and had known Elowen since she was a child, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't speak. None of them spoke. They just sat there behind their council table like a row of fence posts in nice coats, waiting for this to be over. Elowen looked at each of them in turn. Harlan Voss, who had sold her flour on credit twice this fall because she didn't have enough coin. Chester Mills, whose wife Agnes had sat with Elowen at Thomas's bedside in those final hours. Old Jeremiah Cross, who had once told her she had her grandfather's stubborn eyes and meant it as a compliment. Not one of them opened their mouth. There was a word for what they were doing, but Elowen had been raised not to say it aloud, so she swallowed it down and just kept breathing. I have my mother, she said. She's 72. She can't travel in this weather. Mrs. Miriam Rusk is welcome to seek shelter with any family in the settlement who has room, Pike said. I believe the Deacon's family on the south end, you want to separate us. Something shifted in Elowen's chest when she said that. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. You're telling me to leave the home I've kept for 6 years, in December, in this weather, and you want to put my mother in a stranger's spare room. I want nothing, Mrs. Rusk. And there it was. That note in Pike's voice, the one he saved for moments like this, the one that said he found this conversation faintly tiresome. I am administering the settlement's laws. If you have a dispute with the charter, you are welcome to file a written objection, which the council will review in the spring. Spring. She'd be dead by spring if she had no shelter. He knew that. She could see it in the way his eyes moved just slightly to the left when he said the word. He knew it, and he was saying it anyway, and the 14 men around him were letting him. Council Chairman Pike. Elowen straightened up, both hands flat at her sides. She wasn't a small woman, she never had been, and she saw the way some of the men registered that straightening, that extra inch of height, and looked slightly away. She'd learned early that her size made certain people uncomfortable when she stopped apologizing for it. I want to understand this clearly, so there's no confusion later. You are asking me and my 72-year-old mother to leave our home. Today. Before sundown. In weather that is 35 degrees below zero. The settlement will provide blankets. I didn't ask about blankets. The room went quiet. Even Pike stopped writing in his ledger. I asked you to say it plainly, Elowen said, so that everyone in this room knows exactly what's being decided today. I want the men at this table to hear themselves making this choice. For the first time since she'd walked in, Orson Pike looked genuinely uncomfortable, not guilty. She didn't think he was capable of guilt in that moment, but uncomfortable, the way a man looks when someone shines a light directly on something he'd prefer to keep in shadow. Harlan Voss cleared his throat. Everyone waited. He said nothing. Pike composed himself and set down his pen. You have until sundown, Mrs. Rusk. I recommend you use the time wisely. She stood there for 3 more seconds, not because she was frozen, but because she was making a choice about how to leave a room for the last time, whether to cry or to beg or to slam a door. She thought about all of those things in those 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked out. Miriam Rusk was sitting on a wooden bench just outside the council room door, wrapped in that fraying wool blanket, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a church service to begin. She had the kind of face that had probably been beautiful once, and now was just strong. A face that had weathered too many winters and buried too many people to still be softened by either. She looked up when Elowen came out. She didn't ask how it went. She could read the answer in her daughter's walk. How long? Miriam said. Sundown. Miriam was quiet for a moment, then, the sled's in the back shed. Elowen stopped walking, looked at her mother. I pulled it out this morning, Miriam said, matter-of-factly. Before we came in, I figured we might need it. Mama, you didn't think I knew what this meeting was going to say? Miriam made a small sound, not quite a laugh. Orson Pike has been looking at you like a problem he can't solve since the day your father died and you didn't fall apart. Men like that, they're never comfortable when the outcome isn't what they predicted. Elowen pressed her hand over her mouth briefly. Not crying, just pressing. Where are we going? Going? Miriam asked. And here was the thing. Elowen had been asking herself that same question for 3 weeks, ever since Thomas's fever broke the wrong way, ever since she started doing the math on the charter in her head and kept arriving at the same ugly answer. She'd asked herself where until she'd run out of decent options, and then she'd kept asking, and eventually, in the 4th week of her grief and long past the point where most people would have stopped, she'd arrived at an answer that was somewhere between desperate and insane. Blackthorn Ridge, she said. Miriam looked at her. There's a cave, Elowen said. Widowmaker Hollow. I've heard the trappers talk about it since I was a girl. There's a hearth inside, an old one. Whoever used it last left it standing. The rock formation keeps the wind off. If we can get there before dark and get a fire going, Widowmaker Hollow, Miriam repeated slowly, like she was testing the weight of those 2 words. I know what it's called. It's called that because people have died there, Elowen. People have died everywhere, Mama. Elowen looked back at the council building for 1 second. Just one. At least up there, nobody's going to help it along. Miriam was quiet for a long moment. The wind picked up, sent a little tongue of ice-cold air curling around the edge of the bench, and she pulled the blanket tighter. Then she stood up. She moved slowly. She always moved slowly now. But she stood, and her back was straight when she did it. Then we'd better load the sled, Miriam said. What? What happened in the next 4 hours was the kind of work that doesn't look like anything from the outside. No one in Coldwater Crossing came to help them. Not Agnes Mills, who had held Elowen's hand at Thomas's bedside. Not the Deacon's family, who had a spare room and had reportedly offered it to Miriam as charity. Not even the young Calloway boy who sometimes hauled wood for Elowen in exchange for a warm meal and had done so just 2 weeks ago. They watched, though. Elowen could feel them watching from behind curtained windows as she hauled the wooden sled out of the back shed, as she made trip after trip into the cabin to pull out what she needed. Blankets, flour, salt pork, a cast iron pot, 2 axes, a coil of rope, the box of tools Thomas had kept oiled and hanging on the workshop wall. She took his knife. She left his coat because it would never fit her, and she didn't have space for sentiment, and then she went back and took it anyway because she realized she'd been about to make a decision out of grief rather than practicality, and Thomas would have argued with her about that. She took what Clover could pull and what she and Miriam could carry. She left behind the good curtains she'd sewn herself. She left behind the rocking chair her father had made. She left behind the 6 years of accumulated domestic life that had turned 4 walls and a dirt floor into something that felt like them. It was Miriam who said, as Elowen stood in the doorway making one last sweep, "Don't keep standing in it, it doesn't help." So Elowen stepped back out into the cold. She tied Clover to the back of the sled. The old cow turned to look at her with that specific, unimpressed expression that Clover used for most of life's complications. Elowen scratched between her ears once. "I know," she said. "Me neither." Then she picked up the sled rope, wrapped it around both fists, and started walking north. 2 people saw them go that she registered. Harlan Voss, standing on the front step of his feed store with his arms crossed and an expression that she couldn't fully read. Not quite guilty, not quite pitying, something that lived in the uncomfortable space between. And Orson Pike, standing at the council building window, both hands behind his back, watching. He didn't move. He didn't call out. He just watched. She thought about looking back at him. Decided against it. Not because she was afraid of him, she was past afraid. She'd burned through afraid somewhere around the 2nd hour of loading the sled, but because looking back would have meant he mattered more than where she was going. She kept her eyes on the ridge. Blackthorn Ridge rose ahead of her, gray and white and enormous, against a sky that was already starting to turn that terrible flat color. It turned just before the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. It wasn't welcoming. It didn't look like refuge. It looked like what it was. A mountain in December, in the kind of cold that didn't negotiate. But at least the mountain wasn't pretending to be something it wasn't. The snow got worse after the tree line. Elowen had expected this. She had not fully expected how much worse. The snow here had no paths through it, no tracks from previous travelers, nothing beaten down by routine human movement. It was deep and unpredictable and crusted in some places and bottomless soft in others, and the sled fought her every step. Her thighs burned. Her shoulders screamed. The rope bit through her gloves even through 2 layers of wrapping. And the worst part, the part she didn't say out loud, not even to herself, not fully, was that she wasn't sure the sled was going to make it. It was overloaded. She'd known it was overloaded when she loaded it, but she'd also done the math on what they needed to survive versus what they could realistically carry. And those 2 numbers didn't reconcile cleanly, and so she'd chosen survive and decided to argue with the physics later. The physics were now presenting their rebuttal. Miriam walked when she could. She was strong for a woman her age, stronger than most people gave her credit for, which was a quality she shared with her daughter. But this terrain was not kind to a 72-year-old woman's knees, and 3 times in the first hour she slipped and had to catch herself, and each time Elowen's heart did something that had no good name. "I'm fine," Miriam said, the 3rd time, before Elowen could say anything. "I know you are." "You have that look." "What look?" "The look you've had since you were 4 years old and something went wrong that you thought was your fault." Miriam righted herself, adjusted her blanket, started walking again. "I slipped on snow." "It's not your fault there's snow. I'm the one who brought us out here. You're the one who kept us from sleeping in Orson Pike's goodwill." Miriam said it like a verdict. "I'll take the snow." They didn't talk much after that. Talking in that cold cost too much, and they both knew it. They moved in the rhythm that develops between people who have been close long enough that they don't need to narrate. Elowen pulling, pausing, reading the snow ahead. Miriam walking steadily at her own pace, never asking Elowen to slow down, never pretending she was going faster than she was. Clover plodded along behind the sled with the stoic resignation of a creature that has decided the humans are in charge, and whatever they've decided to do is probably going to be exhausting. Darkness didn't fall so much as arrive, the way it does in deep winter. Not a gradual dimming, but a sudden ratcheting down of light, like someone turning a knob. One moment Elowen could read the snow clearly, could see the shapes of rock formations, and the difference between a shadow and a hollow. Then the cloud cover shifted, the last thin light went flat, and everything became shades of dark gray and darker gray. She stopped. She could feel Miriam stop behind her. Clover pressed her warm nose against the back of Elowen's neck, which was either affection or hunger, and at this point the distinction didn't matter much. They were still a quarter-mile from where Elowen believed the cave entrance to be, based on everything she'd pieced together from Trapper's talk and a hand-drawn map she'd copied from memory onto the inside cover of a hymnal 3 weeks ago when she'd first begun to suspect this day was coming. A quarter-mile in this terrain, in this dark, in this temperature, with a loaded sled and a 72-year-old woman and a dairy cow. Those were very long quarter-mile. Miriam's breathing had changed. She was working harder than her voice was admitting, and Elowen's fingers, even through double gloves, were beginning to lose feeling in the tips. She did not let herself think about what that meant. She tucked that information away in the back of her mind where she was storing all the things that were true and terrifying and that she couldn't afford to be terrified by right now. The pile back there was getting large. She picked up the rope and started moving again. She found the cave the way you find most things when you're desperate and out of options. Not cleverly, not by following a careful plan, but by nearly walking into it. The opening was low and black against the darker gray of the rock face, just barely wide enough for the sled if she tipped it sideways, and if she hadn't noticed the faint thread of warmth, not heat, just less cold, drifting from the blackness, she might have walked straight past it in the dark. She stopped. She put her hand out, breathed. There it was, a suggestion of warmth. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. "Mama," she said quietly. Miriam came up beside her, put out her own hand, was still for a moment. "Oh," she said, just that one word, in a voice that had shed every layer of practicality and for 1 second sounded like a woman standing in a church, which was fitting because that thread of warmth in a cave entrance on a killing cold mountain at full dark was, for them, exactly that. It took 20 minutes to get the sled inside, and Elowen would not describe those 20 minutes to anyone. They happened. They ended. The sled was inside. She left her mother and Clover in the entrance corridor, barely out of the wind, and went in alone first with the one small oil lamp they had, to see what they'd actually walked into. The cave opened up. The hearth was there. Old, gray with ash from God knew how long ago, but intact. Someone had built it knowing what they were doing, the angle, the flue shape, the way the stones were fitted. And beside it, in a rusted tin that had kept the damp out, matches. 6 of them. Old but sealed. On a stone ledge above the hearth, a leather journal, dark with age. The covers warped from old moisture and then dried again. And beside the journal, seasoned wood. Not a lot, but some. Elowen stood in the small circle of lamplight for a moment. 6 matches. One chance to get this right. She thought about Orson Pike and his ledger and his 5 words. Then she knelt down in front of that old hearth and got to work. The first match didn't light. Elowen had known, intellectually, that this was a possibility. Old matches, old phosphorus, months or years sealed in a tin that had done its best but wasn't airtight. She'd known. She'd done the math in her head on the walk up the mountain, running through scenarios the way she always did when she was scared. Not to solve them exactly, but to make them less capable of ambushing her. And yet when the first match scraped across the stone and simply crumbled at the tip, she felt the bottom drop out of her stomach in a way that no amount of mental preparation had prevented. 6 matches. Now 5. She sat back on her heels and made herself breathe for 10 seconds. Just breathe. Not think, not calculate, not panic. Just breathe and let her hands stop shaking, because you couldn't strike a match with shaking hands and expect it to cooperate. The cave smelled like cold stone and something older underneath. A mineral smell she didn't have a word for, like the earth had been keeping its own counsel in here for a very long time. The oil lamp threw a small yellow circle of light that didn't reach the walls on either side. Outside the entrance, she could hear Miriam talking softly to Clover in the low, even voice she used when she was keeping herself calm by pretending to keep someone else calm. Elowen picked up the second match. She thought about the angle of the flue, the way the stones were fitted, the draw that had to exist somewhere in that construction, or the man who built it was a fool and he hadn't been a fool. She could see that in the quality of the work even by lamplight, could see the thought that had gone into the placement of each stone. Whoever he was, whatever had happened to him. She struck the second match. It caught. She held it to the tinder she'd arranged, dry bark shreds, the oldest and driest of the small wood, a twist of cloth from the hem of her underskirt that she'd torn off with her teeth because her fingers weren't dexterous enough. And she held very still, barely breathing, while the small flame considered the situation. It took. Then it didn't. The little flame crawled across the tinder and found the edge of a draft she hadn't anticipated, a thin, cold finger of air coming from somewhere in the rock to her left. And it guttered and went sideways, and then it was out, and she was staring at a thin thread of smoke rising from a pile of bark shreds that had given up. 4 matches left. She heard Miriam say something to Clover. Not the words, just the tone. And the tone was still level, still steady, and that steadiness cost Elowen something she couldn't name. Her mother was keeping herself together by talking to a cow in a cave entrance in the dark. Elowen was the reason they were in this cave. She was the one who'd said Blackthorn Ridge like it was a plan instead of a last resort dressed up in confident language. She rearranged the tinder, blocked the draft with her own body, turning sideways, making herself into a wall between that leftward air current and the hearth. Rebuilt the small architecture of bark and cloth, and added a sliver of the seasoned wood on top, just one, balanced carefully, because she needed the tinder to establish before the wood had any chance. She picked up the third match, and then she put it back down. She sat for a moment with her eyes closed. Her father had taught her to build fires, not in a cave, not in an old hearth she'd never seen before, but in the wood stove at home, in the outdoor pit, in the portable iron box they took on the wagon for long hauls. He'd taught her when she was 7, and he'd said, she could still hear the exact way he said it, "The fire doesn't owe you anything, Ellie. You have to earn it." And then he'd showed her what that meant. You earn it by reading it correctly, by understanding where the air wants to move and working with that, not against it. She opened her eyes. She looked at the hearth differently. The draft wasn't just coming from the left. It was coming from the left because there was a corresponding pull somewhere else, somewhere higher, somewhere in the throat of the flue she couldn't see. The hearth was designed to pull air upward. That was the whole point. That was how it drew. But the cold air coming in low from the left was interfering with that pull, arriving at the wrong angle, disrupting the draw before it could establish itself. She needed to block the low draft and protect the tinder long enough for the flue's pull to take over. She pulled off her coat. Not to wear it, to use it. She hung it across 2 stone protrusions on the left side of the hearth, creating a temporary wall. It was her only coat. If this didn't work, she would have 1 fewer match and no coat, and a set of options that were becoming very narrow and very cold very quickly. Third match. She struck it, held it, watched the tinder catch, and this time held. The bark shreds took the flame and passed it sideways, and the cloth caught, and the sliver of seasoned wood darkened at the edge and began to glow, and Elowen placed 2 more pieces of wood with hands that were so careful they were almost reverent, because she understood at this particular moment that she was not just building a fire. She was building the next 10 minutes of her mother's life. The next hour. Maybe more. The wood caught. The flue pulled. Smoke went up. She sat back on her heels and just watched it for a moment. This small, ordinary, impossible fire burning in an old hearth in a cave on a killing cold mountain, and she let herself feel exactly 1 second of something that was close to gratitude without being quite that. More like acknowledgement. The universe had allowed this. She was noting it. Then she put her coat back on and went to get her mother. Miriam walked into the cave slowly, Clover's lead rope in her hand, 1 careful step at a time. And when she came into the firelight, she stopped and looked at the hearth for a long moment. Her face was unreadable in the way it got when she was feeling something she hadn't decided whether to show yet. "You built that?" she said. "Mostly the man who built it, I just convinced it to work. How many matches? Elowen paused. 3. Miriam nodded once. Good. They didn't say anything else about it. There wasn't anything else to say. The fire was burning, they were inside, they were alive, and the night outside was doing what the night outside was doing, dropping colder, pressing in against the rock, doing its level best to finish what the council had started. But they were inside, and the fire was burning, and for the moment that was sufficient. Elowen tied Clover to a rock protrusion near the back of the chamber, close enough to benefit from the fire's warmth, without being so close that a spark could catch. She set down the salt pork in the cast-iron pot and started melting snow. She'd packed into a tin on the walk-up, because they needed water and they needed it warm, and Miriam needed to sit down and eat something. And in what order those things happened was going to require some coordination. She noticed Miriam had already found the leather journal on the stone ledge. She was holding it carefully, the way you hold something you suspect is fragile, turning it over in her hands, not opening it yet, just looking at the cover. Where did that come from? Elowen asked. It was sitting right here. Miriam looked up. I think this cave has a history. I think most places do. This one more than most, I'd wager. Miriam sat down on the flattest section of cave floor slowly, her knees complaining audibly enough that Elowen could hear them from across the chamber, and settled the journal in her lap. Someone here, Elowen, or spent a great deal of time here. Whoever built that hearth knew what they were doing. I noticed. So they weren't just passing through. No. Elowen crouched in front of the fire and adjusted one of the logs. Someone used this place, knew how to use it, and then stopped. Neither of them said what the obvious ending to that sentence was. They left it unspoken in the space between them, which was where certain kinds of knowledge belonged when there was nothing useful to be done about it. Miriam opened the journal. She didn't read aloud at first. She just turned pages carefully, her eyes moving slowly, her expression shifting in ways Elowen couldn't quite track from across the fire. After a while she said, without looking up, his name was Caleb. He was a trapper. He wintered here for 3 seasons. Did he write about the cave? He wrote about everything. Miriam turned another page. He was the kind of man who wrote things down because he didn't have anyone to talk to. She paused. The hearth. He redesigned it his second winter here. The original didn't draw properly. Elowen went very still. Did he write down how he redesigned it? Miriam looked up then, and her expression had changed. There was something alert in it, something that had moved past the exhaustion and the cold and the long, terrible day, something that was almost hopeful. Yes, she said. He did. Read it to me. Miriam read, and Elowen listened, and the fire burned between them. And outside Blackthorn Ridge sat in the killing cold and didn't care one way or another about the 2 women in its belly, but they were in its belly, and they were warm, and they were learning. That was December 11th. By December 14th, the fire had gone out twice. The first time was Elowen's fault. She'd fallen asleep tending it, just dropped straight off the edge of consciousness the way you do when you've pushed your body too far past its limits for too many days in a row, and woke to cold and darkness and Clover's agitated shuffling at her rope, the cow's breath coming in visible clouds in the lamplight. Elowen rebuilt the fire in the dark by feel and memory, and it took 40 minutes, and when it caught again, she sat back against the cave wall and shook for a while, not from cold, but from the particular internal trembling that comes from understanding how close a thing was. The second time was nobody's fault. The wood ran out before she'd expected it to, which meant she'd miscalculated the burn rate, which meant her estimates about how long their supply would last were wrong, which meant she needed to go outside and find more, which she'd known she would have to do eventually, but had hoped to avoid for at least 2 more days while the weather settled. The weather had not settled. She wrapped herself in everything she had and went out anyway. The temperature hit her like a physical object. Not like cold, like a force, something with weight and intention, something that moved into every gap in her wrapping immediately, that found the 1/4 inch of exposed skin at her wrists and the edge of her jaw and went to work on it with terrible efficiency. The snow outside the cave entrance was knee-deep and in places hip-deep, and she pushed through it with both arms, breaking a path, her breath coming in clouds that immediately iced on the wool around her lower face. She found fallen timber under the tree line, old deadfall, not ideal, too much moisture in the outer bark, and she dragged it back in 3 trips. Each trip took longer than the one before because the path she'd broken filled back in, because her legs were tiring, because somewhere around the second trip the temperature dropped again and she stopped being able to feel her left foot reliably and had to keep moving to make sure it was still receiving blood. She didn't tell Miriam about the foot. She dried the wood as best she could by the fire over the next 6 hours, rotating logs, stripping wet bark, keeping the fire small and efficient rather than large and satisfying. Because what she needed was sustainability, not comfort. She knew the difference now. She was learning to know a lot of differences. It was during those 6 hours, while she was sitting in the firelight turning logs and listening to the wind complain outside and reading over Miriam's shoulder as her mother worked through Caleb the trapper's journal page by careful page, that they found it. Not a single thing. A system. Caleb had been a systematic man, thorough in the way that isolated people sometimes become. Not because thoroughness came naturally to him, apparently, based on some of his entries about forgetting where he'd put things and losing count of his stores, but because he'd understood that in this specific place, in this specific kind of cold, being careless about systems killed you. So he'd built systems despite not being naturally systematic, and he'd written them all down, and they were all here, 40-odd pages in that warped leather journal. The hearth redesign. The water collection point he'd found deep in the cave where a natural seep produced clean water year-round. The cache of tools he'd left behind, the ones Elowen had found and dismissed as broken, which Caleb's notes revealed were not broken but disassembled, stored that way to prevent rust. The food stores he'd discovered in a naturally cold secondary chamber. Not food anymore, obviously, years too old, but the chamber itself was still there, still maintained its cold, still usable as a larder. The coal seam he'd found in the third tunnel on the left, which he'd noted was thin but real, good quality anthracite, enough to supplement wood for at least 2 winters before it played out, and perhaps most importantly, the heat. Caleb had written about it in his second winter, almost in disbelief, as though he hadn't quite trusted what he was observing. The cave was warmer than it should have been, not dramatically. It was never going to be a summer afternoon in here, but consistently, measurably warmer than the outside air by a margin that should not have been possible from the hearth alone. He'd noticed it first in a deep fissure in the back chamber, a crack in the rock face where warm air moved, very faintly, very steadily, upward. Something underneath, he'd written. I don't know what. Warm water maybe, deep down. Or just the rock itself, insulated enough that it holds whatever heat comes down from above during the short summer and gives it back in winter. Whatever it is, it's real. I've measured it. The back chamber stays 12 to 15 degrees warmer than the front. That's why a properly designed fire draws so well. It's not fighting the ambient temperature, it's working with a space that wants to hold heat. Elowen read that passage 3 times. Then she said, Mama, we need to move the sleeping area to the back chamber. Miriam looked up from where she'd been reading ahead of her. I was going to suggest the same thing. We should also. Elowen stopped, reorganized her thoughts because they were coming faster than her mouth could manage. The tools. They're just disassembled if I can put them back together, one thing at a time. I know, but Elowen. Miriam's voice was level, not sharp, just steady. The same steadiness she'd been using on Clover, Elowen realized, and under other circumstances that might have been funny. One thing at a time. Tonight we move the bedding. Tomorrow, the tools. You can't do everything in one night when you haven't slept properly in 4 days. I slept. You fell asleep tending the fire. That's not sleep, that's collapse. Miriam set the journal down. Lie down. I'll tend the fire for 2 hours. You need to rest too. I'm 72 years old and I've been tended to my entire life by people who thought I needed it. I am capable of sitting next to a fire for 2 hours without requiring supervision. Something moved across her face. Not quite amusement, something older and more complicated. Let me do something useful. Elowen opened her mouth, closed it. The argument she'd been about to make died somewhere in the gap between her intentions and the reality that her mother was right, and also that she was barely keeping her eyes open, and also that Miriam Rusk had survived 72 winters in hard country and probably knew how to keep a fire going. 2 hours, she said. 2 hours. Then I wake you. She lay down on the bedroll with her boots still on. She wasn't taking her boots off in this cold, not yet, not until she was more certain of the back chamber's temperature. And she was asleep in under a minute, and when Miriam woke her exactly 2 hours later, the fire was burning steadily, and Miriam had also, in those 2 hours, reorganized the supply stack to be more accessible and reread two-thirds of Caleb's journal. "There's more," Miriam said, when she saw Elowen's expression at the neatly reorganized supplies. "When do you sleep?" "I've been sleeping for decades. I'll manage." Elowen looked at her mother for a moment. Really looked, in the firelight, at this woman who had been her constant for 30 years, and who was sitting cross-legged on a cave floor in the middle of a mountain in the worst winter in recent memory. Looking, if not comfortable, then at least present. Fully, completely present, in the way that Elowen had sometimes seen in old people and not understood until now. The way they stopped saving their attention for later, stopped treating the current moment as a waiting room for something better, and just inhabited it, the specific place they were in, the specific circumstances, the specific fire in front of them. "Mama," she said, "are you all right?" Miriam considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm cold," she said finally. "My knees hurt. I'm worried about you, which is a condition I have had continuously since 1876 and shows no signs of remission." She picked up the journal again. "But I'm not frightened. I thought I would be. I'm not." "Why not?" Miriam looked at her over the top of the journal. "Because you're here," she said simply, "and you build good fires." Elowen turned back to the fire before her face could do something she didn't want her mother to see. The tools took 3 days to reassemble, because the disassembly had been more thorough than she'd initially understood. Caleb had broken them down completely, removed handles from heads, packed oil-soaked cloth around metal parts to prevent rust, stored each component separately. It wasn't work she could do with numb fingers, which meant she had to keep the back chamber warm enough to work in, which meant managing the fire more carefully than she had been, which meant being strategic about wood and coal in a way that required the coal seam to actually exist and be accessible. She found the coal on the second day, third tunnel left, exactly where Caleb had noted it. Her lamp almost went out in the tunnel from bad air, and she backed out fast with her heart pounding, waited, and then went back with a longer wick and better air sense, going slowly, testing the flame's behavior. The seam was narrow, finger width at the widest point, but what came out of it was good, dense black coal that caught hot and burned long. She filled a canvas bag and carried it back, and when she fed the first pieces into the fire, the heat that came off it was so significantly better than the wood that she stood there with her hands extended for a full minute just feeling it. Good heat, real heat, heat you could plan around. She started crying, briefly, which was inconvenient and which she did not tell Miriam about. It wasn't sadness. She wasn't even sure what it was. Just a release valve somewhere that had been under pressure for a long time, and the heat had opened it. She wiped her face on her sleeve, let it pass, and went back to work. The tools came together on day 3. A small hand axe, a draw knife, a brace and bit, 2 chisels of different sizes, and a short-handled hammer. Not a full workshop by any standard. But enough. Enough to work stone. Enough to work wood. Enough to do the things she was beginning to think about doing. Because she had been looking at this cave differently since reading Caleb's journal. He had used it as a shelter, a place to survive. And that was what it had been for her too, these first days. Survival, immediate, raw, day-to-day. But the cave was more than a shelter. Caleb had seen that too, in his 3rd winter, when his entries shifted from accounts of daily survival to something more like planning. He'd written about improving the hearth's draw further, about a second sleeping chamber, about a stone shelf he'd been building along the main chamber's eastern wall for food storage. He'd been turning it into something before whatever happened had happened. Elowen had been expelled from her cabin, but she had found something she hadn't expected to find. She had found a place where someone had already begun to solve the problem of living here. And now she had the tools to finish what he'd started. The wall was her first real construction project, not the hearth. She'd worked with the existing hearth, modified it, coaxed it. But the wall was hers from the beginning, stone by stone, filling in the gap between the main chamber and the tunnel entrance to reduce the drafts that stole heat from the sleeping area. She had no mortar, so she fitted stones dry, which meant every piece had to be chosen and placed with thought, had to bear on the pieces below and support the pieces above, had to be stable without anything holding it in place except physics and her own judgment about how things balanced. Her first attempt collapsed on the second day when she'd gotten 5 courses up, and a stone she'd thought was stable shifted at the base. The fall was loud and sudden, and Miriam, who'd been asleep in the back chamber, came out with the hand axe raised and an expression that could charitably be described as ready for violence. "Wall fell," Elowen said. Miriam looked at the pile of stones, lowered the axe. "Did any of it fall on you?" "No." "Then rebuild it. I'm going to." "I know you are." Miriam turned to go back to the back chamber. "I'll get more sleep. Try not to have this one fall on you." "I'll do my best." The second wall held him. Elowen built it slower, more carefully, testing each stone before she committed weight to it, going back and checking the base courses repeatedly before she built higher. It took 4 days. When the last stone was fitted and she stood back and pushed against it, and it didn't move, she felt something she hadn't felt since before Thomas died. Not happiness, not relief, something more fundamental than either. Something that had to do with making a thing and having it work. By the end of the 3rd week, they had a sleeping chamber that stayed reliably warm. A working water source. Sufficient fuel to last, by Elowen's increasingly confident calculations, through February. A stock of preserved food that was lean but manageable. And a system, Caleb's system, inherited and adapted and built upon, for maintaining all of it. Miriam was rationing the flour with an exactness that bordered on scientific. She divided it into weekly portions, then subdivided those by meal, and she kept count in her head with the same precision she'd once used to manage the household budget, in a time when there was never quite enough money and wasting anything was a kind of failure. She knew, without being asked, how much salt pork remained at any given moment. She knew the caloric math of what they were eating versus what they were burning, and she made adjustments, small ones, careful ones, never dramatic enough to feel like deprivation, even when they were, with the quiet expertise of a woman who'd been managing scarcity her entire life and had never once made it feel like an emergency. Clover provided milk, which Miriam turned into the most basic possible approximation of soft cheese by a method she said her own grandmother had taught her, using cloth and a stone weight and time. It wasn't good, but it had protein and fat, and they ate it without complaint, which was itself a kind of achievement. They fell into rhythms. Elowen tended the fire, collected water, worked on construction, went out for wood and coal on the days when the wind allowed it. Miriam managed stores, mended what needed mending, read and reread Caleb's journal, looking for things they might have missed, and cooked whatever there was to cook with the inventiveness of a woman who had raised a family on limited ingredients and viewed the current situation as simply a more extreme version of what she'd always done. They talked more than they ever had. Not about the council, not about Thomas, not about what had happened. Those things existed between them like furniture in a room you'd memorized, always there. No need to keep announcing it. They talked about Caleb's journal, about what he'd been thinking when he made certain decisions, about whether his coal estimates held up against Elowen's observations of the seam. They talked about food, what they'd eat when they could, what they were looking forward to, what Miriam had made when Elowen was a child that she'd been too young to appreciate. They talked about gardening, which seemed absurd in the middle of a mountain winter. But Miriam knew soil, knew what grew in high altitude and what didn't, and the south-facing slope below the cave entrance, if the snow cleared early enough, had real possibility. They talked about the settlement sometimes. Not with anger, mostly. With a kind of distance that surprised Elowen. It was as if the mountain had separated them from Coldwater Crossing not just physically, but in some other way. The way you feel separated from a bad dream by morning. It had happened. It was real. But they were here now, in this specific present tense, and this specific present tense had its own demands that were more immediate and more interesting than the past. But she hadn't forgotten. She didn't think she was capable of forgetting, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be. She'd catch herself sometimes, hauling stone, or working the fire, or coming back inside from a wood run with ice crusting her eyelashes. She'd catch herself thinking about the expressions on those 14 faces. Not Pike, specifically. Not the calculation in his eyes or the particular contempt he'd been too disciplined to let show fully. The others. Harlan Voss's discomfort. Chester Mills keeping his mouth shut. Old Jeremiah Cross, who'd said she had her grandfather's stubborn eyes, sitting behind that table saying nothing. She understood silence differently now than she had in that council room. Then, their silence had felt like betrayal. Now, working stone with tools left behind by a dead man in a mountain that wanted to kill her, she understood that silence was a choice, and that the people who made it carried it with them, and that it was heavy in ways they probably hadn't anticipated when they chose it. She didn't feel sorry for them. She also didn't need them. That realization arrived on a Wednesday morning in the 5th week, while she was working on the second wall, and her hands were bleeding from a stone edge she hadn't noticed, and she didn't stop, just wrapped the cuts in a strip of cloth and kept going, because the work needed doing, and she was the one who was going to do it. She didn't need them. She needed this mountain. She needed these tools, and this fire, and this water, and this woman who was currently somewhere in the back chamber, humming an old song under her breath while she cataloged their remaining salt. She needed the coal seam and the wall she was building and the south-facing slope and the journal of a dead trapper who'd figured out how to make something from nothing in a place that wasn't supposed to support anything. The revelation was not triumphant. It arrived quietly, almost sideways between one stone and the next. She did not need the people who had watched her leave. And that was the first moment, genuinely the first moment, that Elowen Rusk felt something that might, eventually, at some point in the future she couldn't yet see clearly, become its own kind of peace. It didn't last. Peace, especially in a mountain winter, is not a permanent acquisition. It comes and goes, and the days that it goes are long and cold, and the self-doubt that rushes in to fill the space is specific and sharp and finds all your existing wounds like water finding cracks. The hardest day was a Thursday in January. She'd gone out for wood in a gap between storms, and the gap had closed faster than she expected, and she'd been caught in the open in a whiteout with half a load of timber and no visibility past 3 feet in any direction. She'd had to drop the wood and navigate back by memory, by the feel of the slope under her feet, by keeping the wind on her left shoulder the entire way because the cave entrance was upwind and left of where she'd been. She'd found the entrance almost by accident, nearly walked past it, and stood inside the cave mouth for 5 full minutes before she could hear anything over the sound of her own pulse. When she finally came back into the light of the fire, Miriam was sitting exactly where she'd been when Elowen left, and the expression on her face was the specific expression of a woman who had been very frightened and was not going to say so. "Lost the wood," Elowen said. "I see that." "I'm fine. I can see that too." Miriam's voice was entirely steady. "Sit down." "I should sit down, Elowen." She sat down. The fire was warm on her face. Her hands were shaking, which she hadn't fully noticed until she stopped moving, and now she was stuck looking at them shake. "I almost missed the entrance," she said. "But you didn't." "I could have." "But you didn't." Miriam reached over and put both her hands over Elowen's shaking ones. She didn't say anything else, she just held her hands, the way she'd done when Elowen was small, and things went wrong that were too large for a child to fully process, and she held them until they stopped shaking. The storm lasted 2 more days. They didn't go out. They read Caleb's journal out loud to each other, alternating sections, and debated his decisions, and Miriam told stories about her own mother's winters in even harder country further north, and Clover stood in her corner and produced milk with the placid regularity of a creature that had simply decided this was home now and adjusted accordingly. When the storm broke and Elowen went out for wood, the path was buried again and she had to dig for it, and the timber was wet, and it took the rest of the day to haul enough to be safe. She did it anyway. On the 38th day on Blackthorn Ridge, something changed in the light. Not warmth. It was still brutal cold, still killing cold, the kind of cold that had not relented once since they'd arrived. But the angle of the light through the cave entrance shifted, came in slightly differently, and Elowen, who had been living on the mountain long enough now to read it the way you read a person's face, noticed. February was moving toward its end. They were going to make it. But she didn't say that to Miriam. It felt presumptuous. The mountain had taught her not to be presumptuous. But she thought it, standing in the entrance with the wind on her face, looking down the slope toward the white-buried world below. And somewhere past that white-buried world, past the tree line and the creek and the long flat approach, the settlement called Coldwater Crossing, where 14 men had told her she was not strong enough to survive. She thought it. They were going to make it. They were going to make it, and then February decided to make sure they understood that survival was not a destination, but a daily negotiation that never fully closed. The storm that hit on the 41st day was different from the ones before it. The previous storms had been loud, wind that announced itself, that gave you a few hours of pressure drop and cloud color before it arrived and let you prepare. This one came in quiet. Elowen stepped outside at first light to check the wood stores, and the sky was a flat, uniform gray that looked almost peaceful, the kind of sky that didn't threaten. And she stood there for a moment, breathing the cold air and thinking about the light shift she'd noticed the day before, about February's end, about the possibility of March. Then the temperature dropped 15 degrees in under an hour. She felt it happen. Not gradually. A physical event, like a door closing somewhere far above, cutting off whatever thin warmth the sun had been providing through that flat gray cover. The air changed character. It got a density to it, a weight, that the previous week's cold hadn't had. She got the wood inside as fast as she could move, 3 trips at a pace that left her gasping, and sealed the entrance with the canvas panel she'd rigged on a rope system. And then she stood inside the cave and listened to the mountain start to make a sound it hadn't made before. A low, sustained pressure, like something vast settling its weight. Miriam appeared from the back chamber. She stood beside Elowen and listened. "That's different," Miriam said. "Yes." "How much wood?" "Enough. Maybe 4 days if we're careful." "And coal?" "A day and a half of coal left. Maybe 2 if the seam gave me better quality than I think it did." Elowen paused. "I need to go back in for more." "Not in this. Not right now. But if this settles and there's a window, we'll see what it does first." Miriam looked at her steadily. "You go into that tunnel in bad air, with a lamp that's already burning lower than it should be, without me knowing whether you're alive in there." She stopped, composed herself. "We'll see what the storm does first." Elowen didn't argue, because arguing with Miriam about tunnel safety while a storm settled in was a use of energy she couldn't afford. She nodded, and they went inside, and the storm did what storms on Blackthorn Ridge did in late February. It stayed. It stayed for 6 days. 6 days was a different kind of test than anything the mountain had run on them before. The wood burned slower than she'd estimated, which was good, but the coal ran out on day 4, which was bad, and the temperature differential between the main chamber and the back chamber narrowed in ways that Caleb's journal hadn't fully prepared her for. The back chamber had always been warmer. That was the point. That was the natural heat rising through the fissures. But the extreme outside cold was pushing through the rock in ways that the natural thermal rise couldn't fully compensate for. And by day 5, the back chamber was cold enough that sleeping in it required everything they had in the way of blankets and shared body heat, meaning that she and Miriam and Clover all ended up in approximately the same 4 feet of cave floor, like a small, ungainly, mutually necessary pile of mammals that had decided to stop being embarrassed about the situation. Clover, for her part, seemed to find this perfectly reasonable. "She's warm," Miriam observed one evening, pressed against the cow's side. "She is. I've spent a large portion of my life trying to achieve a level of dignity that I feel this particular arrangement does not support." Elowen looked at her mother over Clover's broad back. "Do you want me to move her?" A pause. "No," Miriam said. On day 5, the lamp fuel ran low. Low enough that Elowen made the decision to bank the fire as carefully as she possibly could and let the lamp go out entirely, because she needed the fire to keep burning and she could not keep both going at the same level. The cave went dark except for the orange glow of the banked coals, and they lived in that orange glow, which was less awful than Elowen had anticipated, maybe because they'd been in the cave long enough now that the dark felt less like a threat and more like just the next condition to manage. On day 6, the storm broke. Not gracefully. It didn't end so much as exhaust itself, running out of whatever it had been drawing on, the wind dropping by degrees over the course of 4 hours until what remained was cold air with no particular agenda. Elowen heard the quality of the silence change and knew before she looked outside. She went out, and the world was buried. The entrance area that had been knee-deep before was now chest-deep in fresh-fallen snow that had drifted against the rock face, and the tree line below was invisible under a weight of white that had bent several of the smaller trees into arches. The sky was clearing from the west, blue breaking through gray in the way it does after a serious storm, too bright, almost aggressive, the sun hitting all that white and bouncing back hard enough to hurt. She stood there blinking, taking inventory. They were alive. They had fire, barely. They had enough food for another week at current rationing, possibly 8 days if Miriam worked her particular mathematics on it. They had wood for 2 more days. And they had no coal, which meant she needed to get into the third tunnel on the left today, not tomorrow, because tomorrow's weather was uncertain and she couldn't afford another day without it. She went back inside and told Miriam what she was going to do. Miriam listened. Then, take the longer wick and tie the rope to the entrance of the tunnel before you go in. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway because I want to say it, so let me say it. Miriam picked up the end of the rope coil from the wall where Elowen had stored it. This end stays with me. You understand? Yes, Mama. If the rope goes slack for more than 5 minutes, I'm going to assume something has gone wrong and I'm coming in after you. You're not coming into that tunnel. Then don't let the rope go slack. The tunnel was a different experience in the aftermath of the storm. The outside cold had pushed further in than usual. She felt it the moment she passed the main chamber's boundary, a degree of chill that hadn't been there before, sharper than the cave's baseline cold. She moved carefully, keeping the lamp ahead of her and watching its flame for the telltale flutter that meant bad air was accumulating. The rope played out behind her, looping on the tunnel floor, connected to her mother standing in the main chamber on the other end with both hands on it. She reached the coal seam and began working. The anthracite came out in pieces, some large, some finger-sized, and one section near the bottom of where she'd been working before the storm, where the seam had widened slightly, maybe half an inch wider, which was the kind of small geological gift that you didn't let yourself get excited about until you were holding it in your hands. She filled the bag steadily, working by lamplight, not rushing because rushing in a tunnel with questionable air was how you made a bad situation irreversible. She came out after an hour with a full bag and bleeding knuckles from the rock and absolutely nothing else wrong with her. And Miriam was standing at the tunnel entrance with both hands on the rope and an expression that she immediately replaced with something more neutral the moment she saw Elowen. Good coal, Elowen said. Good. Miriam coiled the rope with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a task. How much? Enough for a week, maybe 10 days if the seam holds. She set the bag down and looked at her hands. The seam widened a little on the south end. Miriam looked at her knuckles. Sit down. I'll get the cloth. I'm fine. Elowen. Just the name. Just that. The tone that had no argument against it. She sat down. Miriam cleaned and wrapped her hands with the same methodical care she applied to everything. Not gentle exactly, not the sort of tending that tried to make the pain smaller by tiptoeing around it, but thorough, competent, matter-of-fact in a way that was its own kind of comfort, like being tended to by someone who took your being hurt seriously without treating you as fragile. Thank you, Elowen said when she was done. Miriam tied off the last wrap. We need more salt pork. I know. What are you thinking? Elowen was quiet for a moment, working through the logistics. There's a hunter, Seb Calloway, the old man, not his son. He runs traps on the western face of the ridge. He's been up here every winter since before I was born. He knows these mountains better than anyone in the settlement. She paused. I've seen his trap markers from the cave entrance when the light's right. He's been active this winter. He doesn't know we're here. And you want to make contact? I want to try. If he's willing to trade, I have things to offer. The coal seam alone is worth a conversation. Miriam was quiet for a moment. Seb Calloway didn't speak up at the council meeting. I know. He was there. I saw him in the back. I know that too. Elowen looked at her wrapped hands. I'm not looking for an apology. I'm looking for salt pork. She found Calloway 3 days later. She'd gone out to check his trap line, not to interfere with it, just to understand the pattern of where he moved, which direction he usually came from, how to place herself in his path without startling a man who spent his days alone in the mountains and likely had a loaded rifle and the reflexes to match. She was standing at the edge of a small clearing, reading the boot tracks in the snow, when she heard him. He was moving through the trees to her left, not bothering to be quiet, which she took as a good sign. A man who wasn't trying to be silent either wasn't hunting or wasn't worried about being heard. He came around the tree line and saw her and stopped dead. He was old, older than she'd realized from a distance, in his middle 70s, maybe more. Big frame that had settled over the years, heavy set in the way that men who'd done hard physical labor their whole lives sometimes became, the muscle and the fat redistributed into something that looked formidable and tired in equal measure. He had a rifle, as she'd anticipated, but it was pointed at the ground and his hands weren't anywhere near the trigger. He looked at her for a long moment. "Rusk woman," he said finally. "Mr. Calloway." He glanced at the cave entrance area, higher up the slope, then back at her. "You've been up here since December." "Yes." "I saw the smoke, figured it was you." He shifted his weight, resettled the rifle strap on his shoulder. "Figured if you were making smoke, you were alive." "We are." He nodded slowly. He didn't say anything about the council meeting. He didn't say anything about what he had or hadn't done that day, what he'd said or not said. He just stood there in the snow with his rifle on his shoulder and the particular expression of a man who was doing arithmetic on something complicated. "We need salt pork," Elowen said, because she hadn't come out here for conversation. "And cornmeal, if you have it. I can trade coal. The seam on the third tunnel runs anthracite. Good quality. I'll show you where it is." Calloway looked at her steadily. "You found Caleb's old seam." She blinked. "You knew him?" "Caleb Morrison. Yes. Trapped with him for 2 seasons before, he stopped. Before he didn't come down one spring." Something moved across his face briefly. "He was a good man, better than most." "He was a careful man," Elowen said. "His journal is what kept us alive up there." That landed differently than she'd intended. She could see it, the way it moved through him, some piece of information shifting into place, making a picture he hadn't had before. He looked up at the cave entrance area again, and when he looked back at her, his expression had changed in a way she couldn't fully categorize. "Salt pork," he said, "and cornmeal. What you said. If you can spare it." "I can spare some." He was quiet for a moment. "The anthracite, if the seam is where I think it is worth more than salt pork and cornmeal. I know that. I'm not trying to cheat you." "I didn't say you were." Another silence. The cold sat between them, patient and indifferent. "The settlement is struggling," Calloway said. It came out of him like something he'd been carrying for a while and had decided to put down. "Worse than usual. 3 families ran low on fuel before January ended. The Dern family had their youngest sick for 2 weeks, the kind of cold sick that turns bad fast. They pulled through, but it was close." Elowen listened to this without expression. "Pike doesn't want to say how bad it is," Calloway continued. "He never does. But I've been hunting for this settlement for 25 years, and I know the difference between people who are getting by and people who are stretching." He met her eyes. "Your coal seam. If it's producing what you say, I said good quality anthracite. I didn't say how much of it there is." She held his gaze. "I'm not a supply depot for Coldwater Crossing, Mr. Calloway." "No, you're not." He said it without defensiveness. "I'm not asking you to be." "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she was about to excuse herself and walk away. "I'm not asking anything," he said finally. "I was just telling you how it is down there. You can do with that information what you want." He reached into the pack on his back and pulled out a cloth-wrapped parcel. "Salt pork. I've got cornmeal at the camp a 1/4 mile east. If you want to come and get it, or if you want me to leave it here tomorrow morning, either is fine with me." She took the salt pork. "Leave it here tomorrow morning." He nodded. She turned to go, then stopped. "How bad is the Dern family?" she asked without turning around. A pause. "Bad enough." She kept walking. The salt pork and cornmeal were better than she'd let herself anticipate, because anticipating things got you hurt in ways that were entirely avoidable. But that night, with soup on the fire that had actual substance to it for the first time in 3 weeks, and Miriam's face in the firelight looking something other than carefully neutral, she let herself feel it, just for the length of that meal, just that. "Seb Calloway is a complicated man," Miriam said, turning her cup in her hands. "Most people are. He had a chance in that council room. He did. And he didn't take it." "No." Elowen looked at the fire. "He also left the settlement to come up here and check on us, in his way. Even if he didn't say that's what it was." She paused. "I'm not saying that makes it even. I'm just saying it's the whole picture." Miriam was quiet. Then, "You're more generous than I am. I'm less generous than you think. I haven't forgiven anything." She stirred the soup. "I'm just counting what's actually there. He's useful and he keeps his word and he knew Caleb and he feels bad about December. even if he's not going to say so. That's what's there. The rest of it is mine to carry, not his. Miriam looked at her for a long moment. Thomas used to say, Miriam started, and then stopped. They almost never started sentences with Thomas's name. Not because they'd agreed not to, but because it was still tender, still the kind of thing that you approached obliquely, like a wound that needed air but not direct touch. What did he say? Elowen asked. He used to say you were the most practical person he'd ever met. He meant it as the highest possible compliment. Miriam set down her cup. I used to think he was describing something small, a domestic quality, being efficient. She shook her head slightly. I understand now what he was actually seeing. Elowen didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. She stirred the soup. It was the first week of March when the hunter arrived. Not Calloway. Someone else. A younger man Elowen didn't recognize, who'd come up from the south slope and found the cave entrance in a way that suggested he'd been looking for it specifically. He stopped 10 feet from the entrance where Elowen was working on a drainage channel. She was digging in the frozen ground to redirect snowmelt away from the entrance corridor, and he held both hands open in the way that people in these mountains learned to do when they approached a stranger's shelter. My name's Decker, he said. I'm not here for trouble. She set down the pick and looked at him. He was maybe 25, lean in the way of men who'd been eating badly for a while, and his coat had a tear in the left shoulder that had been repaired with a different colored thread, and then retorn, and not repaired the second time. How did you find us? She asked. Calloway mentioned there were people up here who might have coal. She kept her expression neutral. Calloway told you. He said someone had found the old Morrison seam. He didn't tell me who. Decker's eyes went to the entrance and then back. My family's in trouble. I've got a wife and 2 young children in a cabin with a cracked stove and about 5 days of firewood left. We're not from the settlement. We've got a homestead further east. Came west in the fall. He paused. I'm not asking for charity. I've got flour, a full bag. I'm asking to trade. Elowen looked at him for a long time. She thought about what Miriam had said back in December, that survival meant little if it turned you into Orson Pike. She'd agreed with it then, and she still agreed with it, but she also understood now, from the inside, what that cost. It cost coal and warmth and margin you'd built up at significant personal suffering. It cost the hard-won excess that kept you from having to worry every morning about whether today was the day the arithmetic stopped working. It cost something real. How far is your homestead? She asked. 4 miles east and down the slope. Half a day in this snow. Your wife can travel? She can. The children too. They're 4 and 7, both healthy. He looked at her steadily. We'd shelter here if you'd have us, just long enough to get through the worst of it. We'd work for what we used. Elowen was quiet for a long moment. She thought about going back inside and talking to Miriam about it. She thought about the coal stores and the food stores and the amount of space in the back chamber and how many people that fire could reasonably warm. And she ran the numbers quickly the way she'd learned to run numbers in 3 months of making nothing stretch to fill every need. It was tight, very tight, but it wasn't impossible. Go get your family, she said. She told Miriam that evening. Miriam took it in without changing her expression, which was itself an expression if you knew how to read it. Then she said, How old did you say the children were? 4 and 7. Miriam got up and went to the supply corner. She stood there looking at the flour and the remaining cornmeal and the salt pork for a moment. Then she started reorganizing it, making space, making the counting visible, so that decisions could be made from fact rather than feeling. They'll need something warm when they arrive, she said. The children especially. I know. I'll make porridge. Mama, the flour will stretch. I know how to stretch flour. She didn't look up from the supply corner. Let me do something useful. The Decker family arrived the following afternoon, and they were worse off than the man's controlled demeanor had let on. His wife, Clara, was holding herself together with the specific taut quality of a person who has been frightened for a long time and has converted that fear entirely into forward motion because there is no alternative. The 4-year-old was too quiet in the way children get when they've been cold and hungry long enough that they've stopped asking for things. The 7-year-old, a girl named May, was watching Elowen with an expression of wary assessment that was startling on a child's face. The expression of someone who'd learned not to trust good news until it proved itself. May's expression, more than anything else, told Elowen exactly what the Decker family's last few months had looked like. Miriam had the porridge ready. May ate 2 bowls without stopping, and partway through the second one, her face changed, shifted from that wary watchfulness into something younger and less defended. And Miriam, sitting across from her, saw it happen and said nothing and simply pushed the pot closer. Clara Decker looked at Elowen from across the fire, and the look on her face was something Elowen didn't know how to receive gracefully, so she looked away. "You can stay in the back chamber," she said. "It's warmer. The ground's not comfortable, but I can show you how we've arranged the bedding to compensate." She paused. "Your husband and I will discuss the coal tomorrow. There are conditions." "Of course," Clara said. "I'm not trying to be hard about it." "I know you're not." Clara's voice was quiet and level. "You don't have to explain yourself to me." Robert Decker turned out to be exactly what he'd presented himself as, which was unusual enough that Elowen noticed it. He worked without being asked, hauled wood in a way that cut the time and the pain of that task by more than half because he was a big man and knew how to use his body efficiently. And he spent 3 hours the first day helping her improve the drainage channels she'd been digging because he'd done similar work on his homestead and had opinions about water management that were, on examination, correct. He didn't make conversation while he worked, he just worked. She found that she didn't mind his presence, which was itself a kind of information. She'd thought after 3 months of learning to live in a space calibrated to exactly 2 people and 1 cow, any addition would feel like an intrusion. But Robert Decker worked with a focused, self-contained quality that took up space without demanding attention, and after the first 2 days he felt less like a guest and more like simply another person who was here. Clara was different. Clara talked. Not constantly, not intrusively, but consistently. A steady low current of words that Elowen realized after a while was how she processed things, how she thought out loud, how she made the world manageable. At first it sat wrong against the cave's established quiet. Then she noticed that Miriam had started responding to it, short replies, then longer ones, then actual exchanges that had the rhythm of 2 women who'd found each other's frequency. And she stopped worrying about it. May attached herself to Elowen in the way that 7-year-olds sometimes attach themselves to adults who seem capable of managing things. Not with affection exactly, but with the practical interest of a child assessing who in the room knew what they were doing. She followed Elowen on the water collection runs. She watched Elowen work the fire without being asked to stop. She asked questions, good questions, specific questions, about why the fire was built the way it was, why certain wood burned longer, what the black rocks were that came out of the tunnel, and why they were better than wood. Elowen answered all of them, because they deserved answers. On the 3rd day, May said, "My papa said you were very brave to come up here." Elowen was feeding coal into the fire. "Your papa doesn't know the full story." "Were you scared?" She thought about the honest answer, which was multidimensional and probably too complex for a 7-year-old, and which she was going to give anyway because she'd decided early on that children deserved honest answers, and that giving them false ones was a form of condescension she'd never respected. "Yes," she said, almost constantly, for the first 3 weeks. May considered this, "But you kept going anyway." "I didn't have another option I was willing to take." "That's what bravery is," May said, with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who had just decided something. "My mother says so." "Your mother is probably right about a lot of things." May nodded vigorously. "She is. She hates it when people point that out, though." Elowen almost laughed. It came up on her fast, and she caught it at the last second, and it escaped as a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't not one either, and May looked at her with satisfaction, like that had been the goal. The Deckers stayed for 11 days. In those 11 days, the cave changed. Not physically. The walls were where they were. The fire was where it was. The coal seam gave what it gave. But the quality of the air inside changed, became something with more layers to it, more registers. There was May's voice asking questions, and the 4-year-old's voice making the specific sounds small children make when they've decided they're safe. There was Robert's efficient silence, and Clara's running current of words, and Miriam's measured responses, and Clover's opinion on all of it, which was delivered regularly and with feeling. Elowen moved through all of it and understood something she hadn't expected to understand. She had been surviving for 3 months. She had been doing it well, doing it better than anyone had given her credit for being capable of. doing it with competence and increasing confidence, and the particular hard-won knowledge of someone who had learned a thing by doing it in difficult conditions. But she had been surviving alone. Not truly alone. Miriam was there, Miriam was always there, and Miriam was more than company. But two people in a cave in winter were a unit, a small self-contained system, and that was different from what the cave held now. What the cave held now was something plural, something that breathed with more than one rhythm, that made decisions from more than one angle, that had more than one kind of knowledge to offer. When the Deckers left, fully provisioned, Robert carrying a canvas bag of coal that would last them through the remainder of winter, and then some. Clara with a small cloth packet of what Miriam called her starter for bread leavening because she'd made one from the materials at hand and was willing to share it, but not all of it. Elowen stood in the cave entrance and watched them go down the slope. May turned and waved from the tree line. Elowen raised her hand. Then they were gone, and the mountain was quiet again. And she stood there in the cold that she knew now by name, that she had learned like a language, and she thought about what Robert had said to her the morning before they left. In the matter-of-fact way he said most things. "Word gets around," he'd said, "about this place. I don't know if you want that, but it will." "I know. People are struggling down there, both settlements east and west. It's been a bad winter." "I know," she said again. "You don't owe them anything." "No." He'd looked at her then, the same assessing look his daughter had, family trait evidently. "But you're thinking about it." She hadn't answered that. He hadn't needed her to. She turned back from the cave entrance and went inside. Miriam was sitting by the fire with Caleb's journal open on her lap, but she wasn't reading it. She was looking at the fire. "He's right," Miriam said without looking up. "Word will get around." "I know, and you've already decided." Elowen sat down across the fire from her mother. She looked at the coal burning hot and steady, at the walls she'd built stone by stone, at the water containers lined up in order of when they'd been filled, at the tool rack she'd made from bent wood and leather thong, at everything she'd made from what Caleb had left, and what the mountain had offered, and what her own hands had figured out through repetition and failure and trying again. She thought about Orson Pike. She thought about his ledger and his 5 words and the way not one of those 14 men had been able to hold her gaze. She thought about May's face going from wary to young in the middle of a bowl of porridge. "Yes," she said, "I've decided." Miriam closed the journal. She set it carefully on the stone ledge where it lived, where it had always lived since the night Elowen found it. She looked at her daughter across the fire. "Then we're going to need more supplies," she said. "I know. And the sleeping area needs to be larger. I've been thinking about how to do that. There's a natural extension to the left of the back chamber that I haven't explored fully. If the ceiling height holds, and we need a system," Miriam said, "for how people come and go, rules, who can stay, and for how long and what they contribute. You can't run this on goodwill alone. Goodwill is the first thing that runs out when people are cold and scared." "I know." Elowen looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about this since Decker arrived," Miriam said. "You made the decision when you told him to go get his family. I've had 11 days to plan what comes after." She reached for the piece of flat bark she'd been using as a writing surface, and the stub of charcoal she used to write with, and she held them up. Elowen looked at her mother, this 72-year-old woman who'd been expelled from her home in a blizzard, who'd climbed a mountain on complaining knees without complaint, who'd tended a fire and rationed flour and read a dead man's journal and kept the mathematics of survival running in her head for 3 months without ever once suggesting they couldn't do it. "All right," Elowen said. "Tell me what you've been thinking." Miriam settled the bark on her knee and the charcoal in her fingers, and she began. Miriam's system was not complicated, which was exactly why it worked. She had divided the problem into 3 parts the way she divided everything, into what you could control, what you could influence, and what you simply had to accept and plan around. What you could control was the space and the supplies and the rules about how both were used. What you could influence was who came, in what order, and for how long. What you had to accept was that winter didn't care about systems, that people in genuine crisis didn't behave predictably, and that any plan rigid enough to cover every situation was also rigid enough to break under the first real pressure. So she'd kept it simple. People who came to Widowmaker Hollow contributed what they had. If they had nothing, they contributed labor. If they couldn't labor, they contributed knowledge, or they watched the children of those who were laboring, or they did the 10,000 small tasks of a functioning shelter that didn't require strength but required attention, tending the fire through the night, keeping water from freezing, mending what needed mending. Nobody was exempt from the system. Nobody was a passenger. In exchange, they had warmth, water, food at the level the stores could support, and the right to stay until the weather allowed them to safely leave. There were two conditions that Miriam had written in charcoal on a flat piece of bark and then transferred to the inside back cover of Caleb's journal because she'd decided the journal was the most permanent thing they had, and permanent things deserved permanent recording. The first condition was that no one inside the cave made decisions that affected the group without consulting Elowen. Not because Elowen was infallible. Miriam was clear-eyed about her daughter's limitations, as she was about everyone's, but because someone had to have final authority, and Elowen had built this place and understood it in the way that only the person who has built a thing truly understands it, from the inside out, from failure forward. The second condition was Miriam's, and she'd said it once and then not repeated it, because she found repetition of rules to be a form of disrespect. What happened inside this cave stayed inside this cave. People's reasons for being here, their circumstances, their desperation, that was theirs. You didn't carry it down the mountain and trade it for status or sympathy or the particular social currency of being the person who knew something others didn't. Some people won't honor that, Elowen had said when Miriam presented it. Some won't, Miriam agreed, but most will. Most people, when they've been given something real, have the decency to protect where it came from. She'd looked at her daughter steadily. And those who don't, well, we'll know about it, and we'll remember. That had been mid-March. By the end of March, 4 more people had found their way to Widowmaker Hollow. Not all at once. They came in the way that news travels through isolated mountain country, which is slowly and by indirect routes, passed from Callaway to Decker to a woman named Fern, who had a cousin in the eastern settlement who knew a family whose eldest son had been hunting the ridge. They arrived separately, over the course of 2 weeks, in varying states of need, and Elowen received each of them the same way she'd received Decker, standing at the cave entrance, arms at her sides, waiting to hear what they had and what they needed before she made any promises. The first was a teenage boy named Eli, maybe 16, whose family's cabin had been abandoned when his father went for supplies in a storm and didn't come back. He didn't say his father was dead. He said his father didn't come back, and the way he said it made the specifics unnecessary. He had a younger sister, 8 years old, who was sitting on a pack at the tree line with the specific exhausted patience of a child who had been following her brother through difficult terrain for too long and had run out of the energy to be frightened. Elowen looked at the girl at the tree line, then back at Eli. "Bring her up," she said. The girl's name was Nora, and she hadn't spoken in 3 days according to her brother, a piece of information Eli offered in the flat, factual way of someone who had become accustomed to managing crisis in short sentences. She didn't speak when Miriam put hot porridge in front of her either, but she ate it. She ate it with both hands wrapped around the bowl and her eyes on the fire, and somewhere in the second bowl she made a small sound, not words, just sound. And Miriam glanced at Elowen across the fire, and Elowen looked away first. Eli worked. I was one of those teenagers who'd had something knocked out of them early. Not spirit exactly, but the layer that makes young people argue about what they should have to do. And he just looked at what needed doing and did it. He was the one who figured out, without being told, that the drainage channel Elowen had built needed an extension on the east side to handle the March snowmelt properly. And he dug that extension over 2 days and it worked. And he mentioned it to Elowen afterward with the same flatness he applied to everything. Just fix the drainage, east side was pooling. "I saw," she said. "Good work." He nodded and went back to hauling wood. The second and third arrivals came together, a married couple from Coldwater Crossing itself, which was the first time someone from the settlement proper had appeared at Widowmaker Hollow, and which created a particular quality of silence when they walked into the main chamber and found Elowen standing there. Their names were Dennis and Ruth Page. Dennis was in his 40s and had been one of the settlement's 2 blacksmiths, which meant he was a man of practical value, and which also meant Orson Pike's resource problems had become serious enough that even useful men were struggling. Ruth was younger, maybe 35, and she was carrying a baby wrapped so thoroughly against the cold that Elowen hadn't realized it was there until it made a sound. Elowen and Dennis Page looked at each other for a moment. He hadn't been at the council meeting. She knew that. He'd been... Where had he been? She ran back through December in her memory, pulling at details. He'd been at the forge, she thought. Or that's what someone had said. She didn't actually know where he'd been. She just knew she hadn't seen his face among the 14. I heard about this place from Seb Calloway, he said. I wouldn't have come if... He stopped, recalibrated. My wife and the baby needed to be somewhere warm that I could rely on. Our fuel ran out 2 weeks ago. I've been managing on borrowed wood from 3 different families and the debt is getting ahead of me. Elowen kept her face neutral. What can you contribute? Dennis blinked as if the directness surprised him. I'm a smith. I can't do smith work up here without tools and materials. But I can haul anything. I can work stone. I know enough carpentry to be useful. He paused. And Ruth? I'm right here, Ruth said calmly from beside him. I can speak for myself. She looked at Elowen with the steady look of a woman who was tired and scared and wasn't going to perform either. I have a baby who's 4 months old and needs warmth more than she needs food right now, and I'm asking you to let me bring her inside where she can be warm. That's the ask. I'll sort out the rest after. Elowen looked at the baby-shaped bundle in Ruth's arms. She thought about the back chamber and the sleeping arrangements, and the coal supply, and the space considerations she and Miriam had been working through. She thought about Dennis Page's labor, which was real and valuable, and Ruth Page's direct honesty, which was the most refreshing thing she'd encountered in months. Come inside, she said. Miriam had the baby's name within 10 minutes, Cora, and had formed an opinion about Cora's sleeping situation within 20, which she communicated to Ruth in the pragmatic, non-sentimental way she communicated everything. Ruth received it the same way. They got along immediately, which Elowen recognized as the specific quick alliance that forms between competent women who have been managing difficult circumstances alone and suddenly encounter someone else doing the same. Dennis Page looked at the walls Elowen had built, and at the drainage, and at the hearth, and then at Elowen with an expression she hadn't seen from a man in some time. You built all of this, he said. Not a question. Most of it. Eli helped with the drainage extension. He turned slowly, taking in the full chamber. The stone fitting, that's dry laid. Yes, that's harder than it looks. He crouched down and looked at the base of the main wall. You're using gravity and friction correctly. If you'd used mortar without knowing what you were doing, it would have cracked in the cold. This way it can shift slightly without failing. He stood up. Did you learn that from someone? From failure, she said. First wall came down. Second one didn't. He was quiet for a moment. I want to show you something, if you'll let me. The east wall of this chamber, there's a way to increase its heat retention by about 20%. It's a technique I use in the forge. The principle's the same. She looked at him. I'm not telling you you did it wrong, he said carefully. I'm telling you there's a way to do it better. Show me tomorrow, she said, after you've rested. The fourth arrival was different from the others. His name was Gerald Holt, and he came alone, in the middle of a night in late March, when the temperature had dropped again and the moon was up, and Elowen heard him before she saw him. Heard someone moving outside the cave entrance with the specific uneven sound of a person who was not moving well. She took the axe and went to the entrance and found a man sitting in the snow against the rock face with his legs out in front of him and one hand pressed to his side. He was a man she knew. Not well. He was from the outer edges of the settlement, a farmer who'd had a homestead a half-mile past the eastern boundary, whose name she'd known without knowing much else about him. Late 50s, heavy-set, gray-bearded. He was breathing carefully in the way people breathe when something hurts with every breath. Mr. Holt, she said. Mrs. Rusk. His voice was steady. I have a broken rib, possibly 2. Fell on ice 2 days ago. Can't make the full walk back down to town, and I'm not sure I should try in this cold. He paused. I'd pay my way. I've got seeds in my pack. Winter squash, 2 varieties, and dried beans, a full pound. Seeds, in March, were not immediately useful. They were the kind of useful that required a future. Spring, planting, the gamble that there would be a season on the other side of this winter worth planting into. Gerald Holt was offering her a stake in a future, which was either very smart or very desperate, and possibly both. Can you walk? she asked. If someone helps me up. She got him inside, and Miriam looked at the way he was holding himself and pressed her lips together in the specific way she had when something required careful thought, and she was already thinking it. "Let me see," Miriam said. He didn't argue. Men who've been traveling alone with broken ribs in the dark tend to be past the point of argument, and Miriam examined him with the brisk competence of a woman who'd set bones and wrapped injuries for 50 years in isolated country where there were no doctors within a day's ride and you learned or people suffered. "2 ribs," she said. "Cracked, not fully broken. You're not in danger of the sharp kind." She looked at Elowen. "He needs binding and rest. A week at minimum before I'd let him walk any real distance." "I understand," Holt said. He was looking at the fire with the expression of a man who has been very cold for a long time and is experiencing warmth as a physical shock. "Mrs. Rusk, I want to say something." "You don't have to." "I want to." He looked at her directly. "I was at the council meeting in December. I was in the back. I didn't vote. I'm not on the council. I don't have a vote. But I was there, and I watched what Pike did, and I said nothing." He paused, and the pause had weight. "I've thought about that a good deal since. I'd like you to know I've thought about it." The cave was quiet. The fire moved. Elowen was aware of everyone in the chamber. Miriam, Eli, Dennis, and Ruth in the back with the baby, Nora who was asleep, and Eli who was not. All of them present, all of them held in a particular stillness. "All right," she said. "I hear you." He nodded. He didn't say thank you, which was correct, because what she'd said was an absolution, and they both knew it. It was just an acknowledgement that the words had been received. That would have to be enough, and he seemed to understand that it was enough and not more. "Rest," she said. "Miriam will bind the ribs in the morning when there's better light." She went back to tending the fire. April came in without announcement, the way seasons change in mountain country. Not a single warm day, but a slow accumulation of less cold days, a degree or two at a time, until you realized one morning that you weren't waking to the same killing chill, and that the entrance corridor smelled different, smelled like something under the snow was thinking about being alive again. Elowen noticed it in the light first. The quality of it through the cave entrance changed in April, became something with more angle to it, more actual warmth in the direct sun, and the snow in front of the entrance started developing that crusted, granular quality that meant it was freezing and thawing in daily cycles rather than just freezing. The cave had changed too. What Elowen and Miriam had built by necessity in December and January had become, over the weeks with other people moving through it, something else. Denser, more layered, more functional. Dennis Page's heat retention modification to the east wall had made a real difference, exactly as promised, and she'd watched him work and ask questions and understood it, not just as a technique but as a principle she could apply elsewhere. Eli had improved the water collection system in the third tunnel based on something his father had done with irrigation back when they'd had a farm, and the result was cleaner water with less effort. Ruth Page had rigged a drying rack from bent branches and rope that solved the endless problem of wet outer clothes, and was so obvious in retrospect that Elowen had felt briefly annoyed at herself for not thinking of it, and then had gotten over it, because there was no version of doing everything yourself in which you also thought of everything. This was what Miriam had been talking about when she said they needed a system, not just rules, a system for receiving what other people knew and putting it to use. Gerald Holt's ribs healed slowly and incompletely. He was always going to feel them in the cold, probably for years. But he was mobile by mid-April, and he spent those weeks being as useful as a man with limited mobility could be, which turned out to be quite useful once he stopped trying to do heavy work and started applying himself to the things that could be done sitting down. He knew more about seed saving and soil preparation than anyone Elowen had met, and he spent 3 days talking her through the south-facing slope below the entrance, what it would and wouldn't support, what to plant first, and in what order, what the elevation would do to the growing season. He drew diagrams in the dirt floor with his finger and then copied them onto bark with Miriam's charcoal. When Miriam told him flatly that diagrams in dirt were ephemeral and knowledge worth having was worth recording. He and Miriam got along in the way of 2 old people who have both spent too long being the only competent person in their respective vicinity and have found in each other a worthy interlocutor. They argued frequently and with feeling about soil management and water rationing and the best approach to preserving vegetables through a second winter. And the arguments were the most substantive conversations Elowen had witnessed in months, and both of them were better for having them. It was during one of these arguments, in the second week of April, that Miriam began to slow down. Elowen noticed it before Miriam admitted it. She noticed it the way you notice changes in something you're watching constantly. Not a single moment, but a pattern, a series of small deviations from the established baseline. Miriam sitting down more often than she had been. Miriam taking longer to finish thoughts. Not because she'd lost them, but because something in the mechanism of getting from thought to speech had gotten heavier. Miriam's hands, which had always moved when she talked, staying stiller. She didn't say anything for 3 days. She watched and she worried, and she told herself it was the accumulated physical toll of the winter, which it was. But it wasn't only that. On the 4th day, she sat down beside her mother while the others were occupied and said quietly, "Tell me what's happening." Miriam looked at the fire for a moment, then, "My chest has been tight for about 2 weeks." 2 weeks. The number landed hard. "You didn't tell me." "I didn't want to tell you during the worst of the cold because there was nothing to be done about it during the worst of the cold and you had enough to manage." Miriam's voice was patient, and also, underneath the patience, something more complicated. "I'm telling you now." "Is it your heart?" "I think it may be, yes. It has the quality of my mother's, near the end, that particular weight." She said it plainly, without drama, without apology. "I'm not in immediate distress. I'm not going to collapse in the next 10 minutes. I'm telling you because you asked and because you deserve to know." Elowen sat with that for a moment. Just sat with it, because there was no useful thing to say in the first 30 seconds that didn't minimize the reality of what had just been said, and minimizing things had never been her habit. "What do you need?" she asked finally. "Less hauling, more sitting, which I've already been doing without you noticing, so it's not as dramatic a change as it sounds." Miriam looked at her. "And I need you to not look at me the way you're looking at me right now for every moment of every day, because that particular expression will exhaust both of us." "What expression?" "The one that's trying to keep me alive by watching me hard enough." Elowen looked away. Looked at the fire, which was steadier than she was at that moment. Breathed again. "Elowen, I hear you. Look at me." She looked. Miriam's face was the same face it had always been. The strong angles, the winter-weathered skin, the eyes that saw what they were looking at without flinching. Just tired, in a way that hadn't been there in December. A kind of tiredness that wasn't about sleep. "I've had a good winter," Miriam said. "That sounds strange to say, given everything, but I have. I've been more awake this winter than I've been in years. You did that." She paused. "Whatever comes, that's true. I want you to know I know that." Elowen pressed both hands flat on her knees and didn't say anything. Dennis Page, who had the excellent quality of understanding when he was not supposed to be in a room, quietly moved himself and Ruth to the back chamber without being asked. Eli took Nora outside to look at the snowmelt on the slope, teaching her, Elowen realized, the same way she'd taught him, passing down the knowledge of reading the mountain, giving the 8-year-old something to look at besides adults who were managing something heavy. The cave held all of them, and it held what was happening between Elowen and her mother, and it was large enough for both. In the days that followed, Elowen reorganized the labor around Miriam's condition without calling it that. She moved tasks, redistributed weight, arranged things, so that Miriam's expertise remained central to what they were doing, while her physical workload diminished to nearly nothing. Gerald Holt, who understood something had shifted without being told the specifics, began sitting with Miriam in the mornings, and the conversations they'd been having about soil and seeds continued, just at a pace that matched what Miriam had available. She was not fading. That word wasn't right. She was managing something that was using up resources she couldn't replenish in this place, and she was managing it with exactly the same methodical discipline she'd brought to everything else in the cave. But the arithmetic was different now, and Elowen knew it and Miriam knew it, and they understood it together without talking about it constantly, because constantly talking about it would have been a form of cruelty. It was in this period that the news came from down the mountain. Calloway brought it. He arrived on a Wednesday morning in mid-April, later than his usual pattern, moving faster than he normally did, and Elowen read the pace of his approach from 50 feet away and felt something tighten in her. "What happened?" she said when he reached her. He was breathing harder than the climb alone accounted for. He stood for a moment, getting his wind, and then he said, "The Thorne family, south side of the settlement. Their cabin burned 2 nights ago. Night fire. They got out, all 6 of them, but they've lost everything. Pike offered them the stable." He let that sit for a second. "The stable. In April." Elowen was quiet. "I told them about this place," Calloway said. "I know you didn't ask me to do that, but the youngest Thorne is 3 years old, and the stable in April at this elevation is still killing cold at night, and He stopped. "I told them." She thought about the space in the back chamber, the sleeping arrangements, the coal, which was running lower than she wanted, but higher than crisis level. The food, which with spring approaching and hunting becoming possible, was the most manageable it had been since January. She thought about Orson Pike offering a burned-out family a stable. "How far behind you are they?" she asked. "About 2 hours?" "Then you should come in and have something to eat while we get ready for them," she said, and turned back toward the cave. She heard Calloway exhale behind her, and it was the sound of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a 2-hour walk and had just set it down. The Thorne family was 6 people, parents, 4 children ranging from 3 to 14, and they arrived the way people arrived at Widowmaker Hollow when they'd been through something recent and terrible, which was quietly, moving carefully, with the specific over-controlled quality of people who were keeping themselves together by will and knew they were keeping themselves together by will and were afraid of what happened if they stopped. The parents were named Harlow and Beth Thorne. Harlow had the hollow look of a man who'd spent 2 nights not sleeping because he was watching his children in a cold stable and counting the hours. Beth had a burn on her left forearm from the fire, not severe, but untreated. Miriam saw the burn before Elowen did. She got up from where she was sitting, carefully, the way she did things now, without drawing attention to the care, and went directly to Beth Thorne with the clean cloth and the tin of rendered fat they used for skin treatment, and she took Beth's arm and looked at the burn with the calm professional attention of someone who had treated 100 injuries and was not interested in either minimizing or dramatizing this one. "Sit down," Miriam said. "This needs to be cleaned." Beth Thorne sat down, and the face she made when she sat down was the face of a woman who had not stopped moving in 2 days and whose body had been waiting for permission. Something in her jaw unclenched. Her shoulders dropped a centimeter. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. This is going to sting," Miriam said. And it did, and Beth Thorne didn't make a sound, and Miriam worked with the same focused thoroughness she brought to everything. The 14-year-old Thorne, a boy named Cass, stood against the wall and watched his mother be tended to, and watched the cave, and watched Elowen with an expression that she recognized. The expression of the oldest child in a crisis, the one who has been managing fear by watching everything and trusting nothing until it proves itself. She went and stood beside him. "You're the oldest?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Then you probably want to know about the layout, where things are, how things work." He looked at her warily. "Yeah." "Come on then, I'll show you." She walked him through the cave the way she'd walked herself through it in December, the way Caleb's journal had walked her through it, the way she'd walked Eli through it, passing forward what she knew in the way that knowledge moved in a place like this, by direct transmission, person to person, because there wasn't any other reliable way. She showed him the water collection, the coal seam, the heat differential between chambers, the fire management, how to bank it, how to read what it was telling you, how to know when it needed coal versus wood, when it was drawing well versus when something was interfering with the flue. She showed him where the tools were kept and why they were kept that way, and she explained the rules, both of them, clearly and without apology. He listened to everything. He didn't ask many questions, but the questions he did ask were the right questions. About the coal supply's longevity, about what happened if someone needed to leave in bad weather, about the burn on his mother's arm. "Your mother is in good hands," she said. "Miriam Rusk knows what she's doing." "Is that your mother?" "Yes." He looked toward the fire where Miriam was finishing Beth Thorne's bandaging. "She seems capable." "She is the most capable person I've ever known," Elowen said, and meant every word of it with her whole body. Cass looked at her for a moment. "Did you really build all of this? By yourself?" "Not entirely by myself in the end, but at the beginning, yes." "Why?" The question was direct in the way teenagers were sometimes direct. Not rude, just without the social layer that adults put between a question and its asking. He actually wanted to know. Elowen thought about how to answer it. The real answer was complicated and had layers that a 14-year-old deserved to have access to, and also that she wasn't sure she could compress properly. Because someone told me I couldn't survive without their permission, she said, and I decided I wanted to know whether that was actually true. Cass was quiet for a moment. Then, was it? No, she said. It was not. He nodded slowly, and she watched that information settle into him the way important information settles into young people. Not with immediate visible reaction, but with a kind of stillness that said it had gone somewhere deep and was going to stay there. The cave held 12 people now. 12 people, one cow, the fire, the coal, the water, the system that Miriam had written in charcoal on the back of a dead man's journal. It was loud in ways it had never been loud before, and warm in ways it had never been warm before. And the logistics of managing that many bodies in that much space were different in kind from everything that had come before. Elowen managed them the way she managed everything, by understanding what each piece required and providing it without ceremony. She was not a natural leader in the way that leaders were sometimes depicted, the kind who made speeches or inspired by force of personality. She was a functional leader, which was rarer and in her experience more useful, the kind who looked at what needed doing and figured out who could do it and put them there, and followed up on it and adjusted when it didn't work and tried something else. She made mistakes. She put the wrong people on water duty 2 days running before she understood that the Thorn's youngest was disrupting the collection schedule by following the water runners and needing supervision, and she fixed it by assigning Nora, who was 8 and solemn and apparently had an affinity for small children, to walk with the youngest Thorn during water runs. She miscalculated the coal consumption for a full cave of 12 and had to go into the tunnel 2 days earlier than she'd planned, and she found the seam narrower at the new extraction point and had to work around it, and she came out with less than she wanted and more than she needed and called it sufficient. She slept 4 to 5 hours a night. She stopped counting hours after a while because counting made the deficit more psychologically real than she could afford. Miriam watched all of it. She watched from her place by the fire, which had become her place the way certain spots become certain people's. Not assigned, just arrived at through the logic of what suited. She watched Elowen move through the cave, and she watched the other people in the cave respond to Elowen, and she said little about it. She'd ask sometimes, at the end of the day, when the cave was quiet and most people were sleeping, she'd ask one question, usually, something targeted and specific. Did you talk to Harlow Thorne about the South Slope? Or, what did you decide about the water schedule? Not oversight, more like calibration, the way a skilled person checks a level to make sure the work is plumb. It was in the last week of April that Miriam said, in the middle of what had seemed like an ordinary morning, I want to write a letter. Elowen looked up from the tool she was cleaning. To whom? To you. Miriam said it without any particular emphasis, the way she said most things. And to whoever comes after, I want to write down what I know, the rationing methods, the food preservation, the things about this place that took us all winter to learn. The way to stretch flour when you're also trying to stretch someone's morale, and you can't let them see the bottom of the bin. She paused. It took Caleb 3 winters to write his journal. I'd like to add to it. Elowen set down the tool. She looked at her mother, in the firelight, with the charcoal and bark pieces arrayed beside her, with the leather journal on her knee. Caleb's journal, the one that had kept them alive. And she understood what Miriam was doing, and she understood why Miriam was doing it now, and she didn't say any of that aloud. You should use the blank pages in the back, she said. There are about 12 pages he didn't fill. Miriam opened the journal to the back, ran her finger down the blank pages. 12 pages, she said. That's enough. She picked up the charcoal and began to write, slowly and precisely, in the penmanship she'd had since girlhood and had never lost. And the scratching sound of it filled the quiet part of the cave, and Elowen listened to it and went back to the tool she was cleaning and did not let her face do what her face wanted to do. Around them, the cave breathed with 12 people. The fire held. Outside, the mountain was considering, very slowly, the possibility of spring. Miriam finished writing on the 3rd day of May. She didn't announce it. She simply closed the journal, set it on the stone ledge where it had lived since December, and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap looking at the fire. Elowen was on the other side of the chamber, helping Cass Thorne understand the coal seam's new extraction angle, and she looked up and saw her mother close the journal and knew without being told. She finished what she was explaining to Cass, walked him through the last step twice because he'd need to be able to do it without her at some point, and then crossed the chamber and sat beside Miriam. "Done?" she said. "Done." Miriam looked at her hands. The charcoal had left marks in the creases of her knuckles that the cold had made it hard to wash out. 12 pages. I had to write small in places. What did you put in it? Everything I didn't see Caleb write about. He was good on the mechanics: fire, heat, water, stone. He was a man, so the things that didn't occur to him were the things about feeding a group of people when supplies are short and morale is shorter, about how to make the same pot of cornmeal feel like enough when it isn't, not quite, about what you say to a child who hasn't spoken in 3 days. She was quiet for a moment. And what you do when someone arrives and they've got nothing left, and they're too proud to say so. How you offer help in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're receiving charity, because people who feel like charity cases stop trusting the people giving it, and then the whole arrangement falls apart. Elowen looked at her. You wrote all of that. In 12 pages, yes, I wrote small. The journal now held 2 voices: Caleb Morrison's careful, self-taught prose working through the mechanics of mountain survival across 3 winters, and Miriam Rusk's precise, dense additions covering everything he'd missed. 2 strangers to each other, separated by years and circumstance, and the particular accident of Elowen finding the journal on a stone ledge in December, now sharing the same worn pages. Elowen thought about that sometimes, how the chain of it worked. Caleb had survived long enough to write it down. She'd found it. They'd used it to survive. And now it was more than it had been. That was not nothing. That was actually quite a lot. May moved slowly, the way spring moves at elevation. Not the sudden green arrival of lower country, but a gradual negotiation between winter and whatever came next, a degree at a time, a foot of snowmelt at a time. The south-facing slope below the entrance developing that saturated dark color that meant the ground underneath was considering the question of thaw. Gerald Holt stood at the cave entrance one morning and looked at that slope for a long time, and then turned to Elowen and said, 2 more weeks, maybe 10 days if the weather holds. For planting? For starting to prepare the ground. You won't plant for a month after that, but if you don't prepare the ground early, the season's already shorter than you want it to be. She'd been thinking about the slope all winter. The south-facing angle that Miriam had noted when they first arrived, the assessment she'd been building in her head from everything Gerald had told her in April about soil and drainage and what plants would and wouldn't tolerate at this altitude. She'd been planning it the way she planned everything now. Incrementally, building the picture from the available facts, leaving room for what she didn't know yet. What do we need to do first? She asked. He told her and she listened, and then she went and got Eli and Cass Thorne and Dennis Page, and she told them what Gerald had told her, and the 4 of them went out the next morning with every tool they had that could turn ground, and they started. The work was brutal in the specific way of early season ground preparation at altitude. The soil was still half frozen below the first few inches, dense and resistant, and they had to take it in sections, working slowly, breaking through the frost layer by small, patient increments. It was the kind of work that didn't have drama, just accumulation. 1 more foot of turned ground, 1 more hour, 1 more day, until gradually the prepared area was large enough to look like something, to look like an intention rather than just a scratch in the dirt. Ruth Page came out on the 3rd day and worked alongside them without being asked, the baby tied against her chest in a wrap she'd rigged from a length of heavy cloth, sleeping through the sound of digging with the complete indifference to inconvenience that very young babies have. Ruth dug one-handed when she had to, and two-handed when Cora allowed it, and she was faster than Dennis despite both of these constraints, a fact that Dennis noticed and had the good sense to say nothing about. Nora and May, who had become inseparable in the way of children who've shared unusual circumstances long enough, took over the small Thorne children during the ground preparation days, organizing them into what they called helping, which was mostly staying out of the way of the actual work, but occasionally involved the genuine transport of small stones from one place to another, and the 4-year-old Thorne's very serious contribution of patting the turned ground flat after it was turned, which was unnecessary but harmless and kept her occupied. Elowen watched all of it and felt something she couldn't fully name, not pride exactly, because pride had an element of personal claim to it that felt wrong for what she was looking at. Something more like recognition. These people had arrived at Widowmaker Hollow broken in various ways, by fire and cold and running out of things, and the grinding specific weight of a winter that had been too much for what they had. And now they were preparing a garden, together, on a mountain slope in early May, with a baby asleep through the noise of it. What they had collectively made was not the life any of them had planned, but it was a life. It was actual, functional, sustained life. She went inside to check on Miriam. Miriam was doing what she did most mornings now, sitting by the fire with a cup of hot water, the nearest they had to tea, reading back through Caleb's journal from the beginning. She said she was looking for things she might have missed in her additions, gaps in the record, places where Caleb had implied something without spelling it out. Elowen believed her, but she also thought Miriam was rereading it because it was the fullest account of how they'd gotten here, and there was something in that rereading that Miriam needed. "Ground's thawing well," Elowen said. "Gerald said it would." Miriam turned a page. "How's Dennis holding up? He's not built for that kind of digging." "He's managing." "Is he complaining?" "No." "Then he's fine." Miriam looked up. "You should eat something before you go back out." "I ate this morning." That was 4 hours ago, and it wasn't enough. The look that went with this statement was not negotiable. "Sit down. I'll get the cornmeal." She sat down because she had learned a long time ago that arguing with Miriam about eating was a waste of energy that could be better spent elsewhere, and also because she was hungry, which she'd been ignoring in the way she ignored most of her own physical needs, rationing her attention the same way Miriam rationed flour, by priority, by what mattered most, by what would fail first if it wasn't addressed. Miriam got the cornmeal and made it quickly, the way she did everything in this cave, without fuss, without ceremony, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had cooked 10,000 meals in difficult circumstances and was not going to be dramatic about this one. She handed Elowen the bowl and sat back down with the journal. They ate and read in silence, which was one of the comfortable silences, the kind that had texture rather than emptiness, the kind that meant neither of them had anything they needed to say at this specific moment rather than anything wrong between them. "Mama?" Elowen said after a while. "I want to go down to the settlement." The journal didn't move, but something in Miriam's stillness changed. She finished the sentence she was reading. Elowen could tell, could track the rhythm of her eyes, even from the side. And then she looked up. "When?" Miriam said. "Soon, before we're into the heavy planting. I need to arrange trades, seed stock, salt, materials I can't source from the mountain. And She stopped. "I want to walk in there while the snow is still on the ground, before everything has changed enough that people can pretend the winter didn't happen the way it happened." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "You want Pike to see you?" "I want to conduct business with whoever in that settlement is interested in conducting business. If Pike happens to be in the room, that's not my concern." "Elowen." "I'm not going to make a scene. I'm not going to ask for anything from him." She held her mother's gaze. "I'm just going to walk in there on my own 2 feet and be what I am now, and he's going to have to look at it." Miriam looked at her for a long time, long enough that Elowen began to wonder if she was going to object, to offer the measured counterargument that she was capable of when she felt one was warranted. She said, "Wear the good coat." The morning Elowen walked down from Blackthorn Ridge was the 12th of May. She'd been on the mountain exactly 152 days. She went alone, which was a deliberate choice. Not because the others couldn't have come, several offered, but because arriving with a group meant arriving with an argument, a demonstration, a point being made with bodies, and she didn't want to make that point. She wanted to make a different one. She wanted to walk in as one person, the same one person who had walked out in December, and let the distance between those 2 moments speak for itself. The descent was easier than the ascent had been, obviously, but it wasn't easy. The snowmelt had made the lower slope uncertain in places, soft ground over still frozen substrate that shifted without warning, and she took it carefully, planting each step. Her legs were stronger than they'd been in December. Months of mountain labor had done things to her body that she'd mostly stopped noticing in the incremental way of changes that happened daily, but the descent made them visible. The way she managed the uncertain terrain without tiring, without the burning she'd felt on the way up in the dark in December. She reached the tree line with the settlement visible below her, the smoke from its chimneys going straight up in the windless morning air, and she stood for a moment. 152 days. She was not the same person who had left. She didn't mean that in a soft, transformational way. She meant it literally, physiologically, practically. Her hands were calloused in places she'd never had calluses. Her face had been reshaped by weather in ways she'd seen in the small piece of polished metal she used as a mirror in the cave, sharper angles, different lines. She knew things she hadn't known, about fire and stone and coal and water, and what people were capable of when the only option was capability. And she was walking back into a place where 14 men had looked at her and calculated that she was insufficient. She walked down into it. The settlement noticed her before she reached the main track. A woman hanging washing in a yard that was still half mud from snowmelt saw her first and simply stopped, sheet in hand, and stared. Two children playing at the edge of the track stopped and looked. A man coming out of the feed store, not Harlan Voss, someone younger, an assistant, pulled up short and then went back inside. And she could imagine what he said inside, because within 2 minutes, Harlan Voss himself was in the feed store doorway. She walked to him first because she had business there, and because starting with the person who felt the most guilt was tactically efficient. "Mrs. Rusk," he said. His voice was complicated. "Mr. Voss." She stopped in front of him. "I need seed stock. Tomato, if you have heritage varieties. Winter squash. I have some already, but I'd like more variety. And salt. I have anthracite coal to trade, good quality, and I can arrange for it to be brought down in quantity." He stared at her. She watched him try to reconcile the woman in front of him with the woman he'd watched walk out of this settlement into killing cold 5 months ago. And she watched the reconciliation fail to complete, because there was too much distance between those two images. "We have seed stock," he said finally. "Good. Then let's talk about quantities." He talked. She listened and negotiated, and the negotiation was honest on both sides. And when they'd agreed on terms, she wrote it down on the piece of bark she'd brought specifically for this, in the charcoal pencil she kept in her coat pocket, and he looked at that. The bark, the charcoal, the matter-of-fact practicality of it, and his expression shifted in a way she didn't investigate. She made 3 more stops. The dry goods supplier for salt, and some medicinal herbs that Miriam had requested. A woman named Della Price, who reportedly had surplus preserved vegetables from a root cellar that had overperformed. The settlement's informal gathering point, the wide front porch of the building that served as meeting hall and general social space, where she knew she'd encounter people and where people would therefore see her and where word would spread faster than she could manage it herself. She was on the porch steps when she heard Pike's voice behind her. "Mrs. Rusk." She turned. He'd come from the council building across the lane, which meant he'd been told she was here and had come specifically. He was dressed properly, coat buttoned, hat in place, the same controlled presentation he always maintained. But something had changed in it, something small, in the way the controls sat on him. Less comfortable than it had been, like a coat he'd grown slightly too large for. He stopped 6 feet from her. They looked at each other. In December, she'd been standing in his council room, in his settlement, under his authority, while he read from a ledger and sentenced her to the cold. The architecture of that situation had been completely his. The ground had been entirely his. This was different ground. "You're well," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." He nodded slowly. He looked at the pack on her back, at the bark and charcoal in her hand, at the people who had gathered. Not a crowd, just the ambient population of a small settlement's public space, doing their own business and doing it now in the specific direction of this conversation. "The settlement is interested," he said, "in establishing a formal arrangement regarding the coal and regarding the shelter on the ridge, if it's to continue operating as it has been." She looked at him. "Who told you about the shelter? People talk." "They do." She held his gaze. "What kind of formal arrangement?" He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "The council has drafted, Mr. Pike." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I don't operate under your council's charter. I haven't since December. If you want to discuss a trade arrangement, I'm interested. If you want to discuss what the council has drafted about land on a mountain that your charter has never covered and that I have been maintaining for 5 months, That's a different conversation, and it's one I'd want to think carefully about before having. He stood with the folded paper in his hand. Around them, the settlement's ambient noise had gone quiet, in that way it did when something was happening that people knew mattered. She watched him do the calculation. She could see it, the adjustment, the recalibration, the thing that happened when a man who had operated from a position of unchallenged authority for long enough that he'd forgotten it was a position encountered someone who wasn't inside it anymore. He folded the paper and put it back in his coat. "A trade arrangement," he said. Then, "Yes. Come to the Ridge next week if you want to understand what we have to offer. Come as a trading partner, not as council chairman. Bring someone who can negotiate practically." She paused. "Bring Harlan Voss. He's been reasonable." She walked down the porch steps and continued to Della Price's root cellar, and she did not look back, and the settlement watched her go with a silence that felt entirely different from the silence 5 months ago when they'd watched her leave with a sled and an old cow and her mother wrapped in a fraying blanket. Orson Pike stood on the lane for a long time after she'd gone. Calloway told her about it later with the flat economical delivery he used for all information. "He stood there a while," Calloway said. "Then he went back to the council building. He didn't come back out that afternoon." She was back on the mountain before dark, the pack heavier on the way up than it had been on the way down, which was how trade was supposed to work. She told Miriam about it that night, after the others were settled, sitting beside the fire in the specific quiet that had become their private time by unspoken agreement. The end of the day, when the cave was down to its essential voices, the fire, and the breathing of sleeping people, and the two of them. Miriam listened to all of it without interrupting. "He backed down," she said when Elowen finished. "He adjusted." "Is there a difference?" Elowen thought about it. "Yes," she said. "Backing down is about losing. Adjusting is about understanding that the situation is different than you thought it was." She paused. "I don't know which one it was for him. Maybe I never will." "Does it matter?" "Not for anything practical. Maybe for something else." She looked at the fire. "I spent a lot of winter being angry at him. Not showing it, just carrying it. And walking into that settlement today, I thought I'd feel it again, the anger. But mostly, I just felt interested in the transaction, in what we could build from here." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "That's not the same as forgiveness." "No, I know it isn't." "Good. I wasn't going to tell you it should be." Miriam shifted slightly, and Elowen heard the small sound that accompanied the shifting, the careful breath. "Some things aren't for forgiving, they're just for moving past." "Is there a difference?" Elowen said, using Miriam's own question back at her. Miriam looked at her with an expression that had something in it that was almost amusement. "Yes," she said. "Forgiving is something you do for the other person. Moving past is something you do for yourself." She picked up the journal from the ledge, turned it in her hands. "I want to think that what's in here, Caleb's and mine, I want to think that whoever reads it next will be able to move past things they didn't deserve. That's what I was trying to write. Not instructions. Permission." Elowen looked at her mother's face in the firelight. The tiredness that had been gathering since March was still there. It hadn't left. The chest tightness came and went, and some days were better than others. And Miriam moved through the bad days with the same steady discipline she moved through everything. But Elowen could read the difference now between what Miriam showed and what Miriam was managing underneath. She'd learned to read it the way she'd learned to read the fire and the snow and the coal seam, by attention, by time, by caring enough to look past the surface. "Mama," she said, "do you want to go down from the mountain?" Miriam looked at her. "When the weather permits. If you want to be somewhere easier, somewhere flatter, somewhere that has more—" She stopped. "I'm asking what you want. Not what you think I need, not what makes the most practical sense. What you want." Miriam was quiet for a long time. "I want to be here," she said finally. "I know what that costs, and I know what it means, and I want to be here." She looked around the cave, at the walls Elowen had built, the hearth that drew clean, the tool rack, and the supply corner, and the journal on the ledge. "I didn't survive this winter in a stranger's spare room in Coldwater Crossing. I survived it here. This is where I want to be." Elowen nodded. She didn't say anything else about it. She reached over and put her hand over her mother's, the way Miriam had held hers on the Thursday in January when she came back from the whiteout with shaking hands. She held it, and Miriam let her, and the fire burned between them, and around them the 12 people of Widowmaker Hollow breathed in the rhythm of people who were safe enough to sleep. Miriam died on the 14th of June. It was morning, and the sun was coming through the cave entrance at the angle it had in June, the longest light of the year, and she was in the sleeping place she'd occupied since December. And Elowen was beside her, and it was not dramatic in the way that deaths in stories sometimes are. It was quiet. It was the kind of death that comes to people who have spent themselves fully and have nothing left to withhold, a slow, complete cessation, like a fire that has burned everything available to it and goes out not in failure but in completion. Elowen sat beside her for a long time. The others knew without being told. They gave her the space of the morning, kept the children occupied outside, kept the cave quiet. Gerald Holt went and sat at the entrance and nobody went past him. Dennis Page built the fire up without being asked, because the cave needed to be warm and because it was something he could do. Cass Thorne, who had developed the quality of useful presence without intrusion, put a cup of hot water beside Elowen's hand sometime in the middle of the morning and then went away again without saying anything. She buried her mother in the back chamber of the mountain, in a protected alcove she'd had in mind since April, without letting herself fully think about why. She buried her with the piece of bark she'd been writing on, the charcoal, and the small brass button that had come off Thomas's coat that Elowen had been carrying in her pocket since December. She didn't know if Miriam would have wanted the button, but it felt right to have them together. She kept the journal. The summer that followed was the fullest season Elowen had ever moved through. The garden on the south slope produced beyond Gerald Holt's conservative estimates, which he attributed to the soil composition, and which Elowen attributed to the fact that everyone in the cave had put something into that ground, day after day, with the specific investment of people who understood that it was directly connected to whether they ate next winter. That kind of attention shows up in what grows. She believed that without being able to prove it. The trade arrangement with Coldwater Crossing was established on the terms she'd set, not Pike's. She'd gone down twice more with Callaway, conducted the negotiations with Harlan Voss as intermediary, and the terms were straightforward. Coal and shelter access in exchange for seed stock, preserved goods, and materials she couldn't source from the mountain. Nobody from the settlement climbed to Widowmaker Hollow looking for gold or harboring conspiracy theories. They came because they needed what was there, and they behaved themselves because the alternative was not coming back. Pike signed the agreement. He came to the mountain once, alone, in late June, and walked through the cave with the careful attention of a man recalibrating his understanding of something. He asked practical questions. He didn't ask anything personal. He left without incident. Callaway, afterward, he was quiet the whole way back down. Good, she said. One by one through the summer, the families who had wintered at Widowmaker Hollow rebuilt their lives enough to leave. The Deckers went back east to their homestead in July with a full summer's supply of seeds and a pack of preserved food and Ruth's bread leavening starter, divided now so that everyone had some. Eli and Nora stayed through August, until a message came via Callaway that Eli's extended family had located them and were waiting in the eastern settlement, and Eli packed their things with the same wordless efficiency he brought to everything, and then stood in the cave entrance for a long moment before he left. Elowen was outside when he came out, working on the drainage channel's fall extension. "Mrs. Rusk," he said. "Eli." He didn't say what he was trying to say for a moment. It was in him, but it wasn't finding the path out, which was a problem he had, she'd noticed over the months, with things that mattered to him specifically. "The water collection," he said finally. "What I did in the tunnel. You should know why it works. It's the same principle as—" "I know why it works," she said. "You showed me when you built it." He nodded. He shifted his pack. He was looking at the ground, which was what he did when the alternative was letting her see his face. "Take care of Nora," she said. "I will." He looked up. "Thank you for—" And then he stopped again, the sentence going somewhere it couldn't complete. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, the way she'd have done with her own brother if she'd had one, and he stood still for it and then stepped back and went. She watched him and Nora until the tree line took them. Then she went back to the drainage channel because it needed doing. Gerald Holt didn't leave. He said he was staying through another winter because the spring planting would need experienced management, and he didn't have much left to go back to, and the seeds he'd put in the ground were his seeds, carried up the mountain in his pack through the February cold. He had a proprietary interest. He was staying. She didn't argue. The Thorne family stayed too, by choice. Harlow Thorne told her in September that the cabin site in the settlement was being rebuilt through a community labor arrangement, and that they'd return for it eventually, but that his wife wanted the children to have another winter here, and that he personally found the work satisfying in ways the settlement hadn't offered him, and that if she had use for him, he'd like to stay useful. She had use for him. By the 1st of October, when the light shifted again toward the angle that meant the serious cold was coming, Widowmaker Hollow held 7 permanent residents: Elowen, Gerald Holt, Calloway, who had made the pragmatic decision in September that wintering at the cave was superior to wintering alone on the ridge, which he delivered as a logistical observation rather than a sentiment, the Thorne family, and a woman named Frances who had arrived in August alone, asking only for work and a place to learn what Elowen knew, and who had turned out to know quite a bit herself about herb cultivation and plant medicine that filled gaps in what they had. In October, Elowen sat down with the journal. Not Caleb's pages, not Miriam's additions. She turned to the very back of the journal, past Miriam's 12 pages, past the inside back cover. She found 3 blank pages she hadn't seen before, hiding behind the back cover, folded in, stuck to it by an old water stain that had dried them together. She peeled them apart carefully. 3 pages. She picked up the charcoal. She didn't know how to write the way Miriam had written, with that precise, dense hand that fit everything. She wrote the way she did most things, directly, practically, without much ornamentation, always starting from what someone arriving from nothing would need to know first. She wrote about the matches, about how many you needed and why 3 sometimes failed before the one that caught, and why that didn't mean you were doing it wrong. She wrote about the coal seam and the bad air in the tunnel, and how to read a lamp flame when it started to struggle. She wrote about the water collection and the drainage and the heat differential in the back chamber. And then she wrote something she hadn't planned to write, something that came out between one sentence and the next, from somewhere she hadn't expected it. The people who tell you that you won't survive without them are usually telling you something about themselves, not about you. I came up this mountain because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because I found out I was capable of things I hadn't known about. I don't know if you're reading this in similar circumstances, but if you are, if you've been told you're not enough, not strong enough, not the right kind of person to endure what's in front of you, I want you to know that the person who told you that doesn't have access to what's actually inside you. Neither do I, reading forward from where I sit. But you do. And you'll find it when you need it, probably not gracefully, probably not without cost, but you'll find it. That's what this mountain taught me. E. Rusk, October 1890. She closed the journal. She set it on the ledge where it had lived since December, where Caleb had left it, where Miriam had added to it, where it would wait for whoever came next. Then she went to tend the fire, because the first October cold was settling in and the fire needed attending, and that was the work in front of her. And she had learned a long time ago that the work in front of you was the most honest thing there was. Outside, the mountain held its position, indifferent and enormous. Blackthorn Ridge, Widowmaker Hollow, the south-facing slope with its turned soil and its seed beds and its drainage channels that handled snowmelt correctly now. The coal seam in the 3rd tunnel on the left. The hearth that drew clean. The place that had been intended to finish her. That had instead become, stone by stone and season by season, the true